The morning her father handed her away, Eliza Morgan did not cry. She had already used every last tear the night before. Alone on the floor of the room she would never sleep in again. She picked up her 2 worn bags, walked past her brothers without a word, and stopped at the front door. She turned back once. Her father was already sitting at his desk. He did not look up. She walked out, and the door closed behind her like the sound of a verdict being read aloud. If this story already has you feeling something deep in your chest, please subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and follow every part of Eliza's journey to the very end. Drop a comment below and tell me what city or town you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The morning her father handed her away, Eliza Morgan did not cry. She had already used every last tear the night before. Alone on the floor of the room she would never sleep in again, pressing her face into the quilt her mother had sewn before she died. Trying to breathe through the kind of pain that doesn't announce itself with drama, but settles into your bones like cold that never quite leaves. She picked up her 2 worn bags, walked past her brothers without a word, and stopped at the front door. She turned back once. Her father was already sitting at his desk. He did not look up. She walked out, and the door closed behind her like the sound of a verdict being read aloud, final, clean, irreversible. Samuel Morgan had made his decision 3 days earlier, and he had delivered it the way he delivered most things in his life, without apology, without softness, without any acknowledgement that the person sitting across from him was his own blood. "You're going to Nathan Cole's ranch," he'd said, sliding a folded letter across the kitchen table, as though it were a business transaction and not the disposal of his youngest daughter. "He's a bachelor. Needs someone to keep his house, manage his kitchen, handle his records." "You'll go." Eliza had stared at the letter without touching it. "You're sending me away," she said. It wasn't a question. "I'm making an arrangement," Samuel replied, and he said it so evenly, so without remorse, that for one terrible moment Eliza wondered if he'd practiced the words in front of a mirror. "The boys need the resources. This ranch can't carry 4 adults through another hard winter. You're the one who makes the least sense to keep." "The least sense," she repeated quietly. "Eliza." His voice carried the particular brand of impatience men use when they want to end a conversation they should never have started. "You're 26 years old, you're not married. You've had chances and you've let them pass. A woman your age with no husband is a liability I can no longer." "Stop." Her voice came out smaller than she intended. She pressed her palm flat against the table. "Just stop." He stopped, but not out of respect. He stopped because he'd said everything he needed to say, and she hadn't yet accepted it, and that inconvenience irritated him. She looked at him, really looked at him the way she hadn't allowed herself to do in years, because looking too closely at the truth of who her father was had always cost her something she couldn't afford to lose. She looked at the deep lines of his face, the gray at his temples, the hands that had built a ranch from nothing and never once reached out to comfort any of his children in a moment of grief. "Is that all I'm worth to you?" she asked. "Truly. Is that the sum of it?" Samuel Morgan picked up his pen. "The wagon leaves Thursday morning," he said. "Have your things packed by dawn." That was 3 days ago. And now Eliza was on a mountain trail in the Colorado high country with $40 tucked into her boot, her mother's Bible wedged between 2 dresses in one of her bags, and the particular kind of silence around her that only exists when a person has walked far enough from everything familiar that the world stops recognizing them. She had not eaten since the morning before. She had slept on the ground the previous night, wrapped in her coat with the sound of the wind moving through the pines above her and the distant call of something wild she didn't try to identify. She was not afraid of the wilderness. She was afraid of what it said about her life that the wilderness felt less cruel than the house she'd grown up in. The trail climbed steadily upward through country that was beautiful in the way that indifferent things are beautiful, not caring whether you noticed or not softening itself for your comfort. The peaks above her were still holding snow even in July. The air at this altitude had a bite to it that reminded her lungs they were working harder than usual. The path was narrow and uneven, carved more by weather and animal traffic than by any deliberate human hand. and her bags were heavy enough that her shoulders had gone past, aching into something quieter and more persistent. She stopped once, set the bags down, and pressed both hands against a boulder to catch her breath. "You are not going to cry on this trail," she told herself out loud, because she'd found that saying things aloud to herself was the only reliable way to make them stick. "You are not going to cry. You are going to walk, and you are going to arrive, and you are going to figure out what comes next. That is all." She picked the bags back up. She kept walking. The thing about Eliza Morgan that her father had never understood, the thing, in fact, that most people in the town of Crestfield had never understood, was that she was not what she appeared to be. She appeared to be a quiet woman, unassuming, a little plain, people sometimes said, though they usually said it behind her back and with a tone that suggested they considered plainness a kind of moral failure. She was medium height, with dark hair she kept pinned back practically rather than decoratively, and hands that were more capable than delicate, and a way of moving through a room that didn't ask for anyone's attention. But underneath the quiet surface, Eliza Morgan had a mind that worked like a piece of precision machinery. She had taught herself to read financial ledgers at age 14, sitting at the kitchen table after everyone else had gone to bed, working through her father's account books by lamplight because she'd noticed a pattern of errors that nobody else seemed to see. She'd corrected those errors without telling anyone, simply worked through the numbers, identified where the miscalculations lay, and made adjustments in a separate ledger she kept hidden under her mattress. 2 months later, when her father had discovered that the financial picture was somehow better than he'd thought, he'd attributed it to luck and a good cattle season. He'd never considered that it might be his daughter. By the time she was 18, she understood cattle pricing, land valuation, seasonal cash flow, and the particular mathematics of surviving a bad winter without losing your stock. She understood contracts and how people buried dishonest language inside honest-looking sentences. She understood the difference between a rancher who was struggling and one who was being deliberately squeezed by someone with more resources and less conscience. She had tried once to tell her father what she knew. She had sat across from him in his office. She was 19 then, and she'd spent 3 weeks preparing what she was going to say, and she'd laid out everything she'd discovered about their accounts, about the supplier who was overcharging them, about the land agreement their neighbor had drafted in language that quietly gave him rights he hadn't negotiated for. Her father had listened, and then he'd said, "Where did you get these ideas?" "From reading the documents," she'd said. "Women don't read contracts, Eliza." "This one does." He'd stood up. He'd taken her carefully organized papers and placed them in his desk drawer without reading them. And he'd said, "Go help your mother with dinner." She'd walked out of that office and she'd made herself a promise. She would never again offer what she knew to someone who had already decided she had nothing worth offering. She kept that promise for 7 years. For 7 years, she'd watched from the edges of every family conversation about money, land, cattle, and business. She'd listened. She'd taken notes in her head. She'd seen her brothers make decisions she knew were wrong, and she'd said nothing. She'd watched her father's ranch slowly lose the ground she'd been trying to help him hold, and she'd pressed her lips together and kept her knowledge to herself, because he had told her clearly that it did not belong in the room. But she'd kept the knowledge sharp. She'd kept studying, kept reading, kept teaching herself, not because she believed someone would eventually ask for it, but because the knowing itself was a thing that belonged to her. It was hers. Nobody could take it away from her. Nobody could tell her it didn't exist. No matter what her father said about her worth, no matter what the men of Crestfield thought, when they looked at her and saw only an unmarried woman past the age when marriage was considered graceful, she had this. She had the knowing. And now, walking up this mountain trail toward a stranger's ranch, she thought, let's see if it's worth anything here. She arrived at Nathan Cole's property an hour before sundown. She almost walked past it. The cabin from the trail in a way that suggested it had been built by someone who didn't particularly want to be found. It was solid, well built, she noticed, with none of the neglect that came from a man who'd stopped caring about his own space, but it was deliberately unassuming. No signs, no decorative touches, A barn to the left, a corral behind it, a kitchen garden on the south side that was producing food, but had not been tended to with any care in the aesthetic sense, just in the practical one. There was a man working at a fence line along the corral. He was tall, broad-shouldered, in the way that came from years of actual labor rather than performance of it. His hat was pulled low against the late afternoon sun, and he was setting a new post with the focused efficiency of someone who'd done this particular task enough times that his body knew exactly what to do. And his mind was free to be somewhere else entirely. He heard her footsteps, or perhaps he simply sensed them, the way people who've spent years alone in remote places sometimes develop an awareness that operates below conscious thought, and he turned. He looked at her. She looked at him. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Eliza had prepared herself for any number of first reactions. Suspicion, dismissal. The particular look men gave a woman traveling alone that was equal parts judgment and edge. She had her explanation ready, her letter from her father ready, her carefully composed expression of competent indifference ready. Nathan Cole looked at her bags first, then at her face. Then at the angle of her shoulders, which had been carrying weight for 2.5 days, and were doing their best not to show it. He set down his post-hole digger, walked toward her without hurrying, and took both bags out of her hands before she had processed that he was reaching for them. "You eaten?" "Just that." "Who are you?" Not "what are you doing here?" Not "I wasn't expecting you until tomorrow," or "you look terrible," or any of the dozen things that would have been technically accurate and entirely beside the point. Just "you eaten." Eliza stood there for a moment with empty hands and the strange disorienting feeling of having been seen not all the way through, not yet but acknowledged. Registered. Treated as a person whose immediate physical state mattered. "Not since yesterday morning," she said. He nodded as though this confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Come inside," he said. She followed him. The interior of the cabin was clean in the way a man's space is clean when he has precise habits and no interest in decoration, everything in its functional place. Nothing unnecessary, nothing soft. A large table dominated the main room. Shelves along one wall held tools, equipment, a few books. A stone fireplace at the far end. A window on the east side that would catch morning light. He put her bags down, near the door, and moved to the kitchen area, with the practiced economy of someone who cooked for himself every day, and had long since stopped making it complicated. Within 20 minutes there was food on the table, nothing fancy, salt pork and cornbread and coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, but hot and real and more than enough. He sat across from her. He didn't ask her to explain herself while she was eating. He didn't fill the silence with conversation. He just let her eat. When she was done, he poured more coffee into her cup without asking if she wanted it. He'd apparently observed that she did, and then he sat back and looked at her in the direct, unembellished way she was starting to understand was simply how he looked at things. "Samuel Morgan's daughter," he said. "Yes, he wrote me a letter." "I know. Said you could manage a household. Among other things," she said. Something shifted in his expression, not quite amusement but adjacent to it. An acknowledgement that there was more to what she'd said than its surface. What other things? She looked at him steadily. Financial records. Account management, cattle pricing, land agreements. Supply chain costs, the difference between a good contract and one that's been written to take advantage of whoever signs it. He was quiet for a moment. "Your father sent you away," he said, "and you know all that." "Yeah." "Did he know? I told him once. He told me women don't read contracts." Nathan Cole was quiet again. He turned his coffee cup in a slow circle on the table, looking at it, and she had the sense he was deciding something, not about whether to believe her, but about what to do with the fact that he did. "I'll be straight with you," he said finally. "I agreed to this arrangement because I needed someone to manage the house, and I don't have time to do it myself. That's what your father offered. That's what I was expecting." "I understand. But if what you're saying is true," he paused. "My accounts are a mess. I know they are. I've been doing my own bookkeeping for years, and I know I'm losing money somewhere that I can't find. I don't have the patience for it, and I don't have the training." Eliza folded her hands on the table. Show me the books. He looked at her. Not tonight, she added. Tonight I need to sleep. But tomorrow show me the books and give me 3 days, and I'll tell you exactly where you're losing money and how to stop it. He studied her for a long moment. The firelight moved across his face. Outside, the wind had come up and was moving through the pines with that sound that was almost like water. The room at the back is yours, he said. There's a latch on the inside of the door. She understood what he was telling her, that he was not the kind of man she needed to be afraid of. That the latch was hers to use or not, as she chose, but that it was there. Thank you, she said. 1 month, he said. That was the arrangement. 1 month, she agreed. She stood up and picked up her bags. Mr. Cole. He looked up at her. I didn't come here for charity, she said. I came here because I didn't have another choice. But I intend to earn what I take, and I intend to be useful in ways that matter. If that works for you, this month could be worth something to both of us. If it doesn't, I'll be gone before the month is out. He held her gaze for a moment. Get some sleep, he said. She went to the back room. She closed the door. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed and pressed both palms flat against her thighs and breathed slowly in and out for a long time, letting the day settle through her. She thought about her father sitting at his desk. She thought about the sound of the door closing. She thought about the 2.5 days on the trail, sleeping on the ground, eating nothing, carrying everything she had on her own 2 shoulders without a single person to help her. And then she thought about a man she'd known for less than 2 hours who had, without any fanfare or apparent agenda, picked up her bags, made her food, told her the latch was on the inside of the door, and asked her to show him where he was losing money. She lay down on the bed with her coat still on. She was asleep within minutes. She woke before dawn to the sound of Nathan moving around in the main room, quietly, deliberately, with the careful restraint of someone trying not to wake someone else. She lay still for a moment listening to it, the rhythm of someone who lived alone making adjustments for another presence. It was a small thing, it was not a small thing. She rose dressed and came out. He was at the stove. He glanced at her, registered that she was up, that she looked rested, that she'd found her footing faster than he might have expected, and he poured a second cup of coffee. Books are on the second shelf, he said. 3 ledgers. Brown covers. She found them. She sat at the table with the ledgers and the coffee, and the pale early morning light coming through the east window, and she opened the first book. She began to read. An hour later, Nathan came back inside from his morning chores. He stopped when he saw her. She had the 3 ledgers open simultaneously, a piece of paper between them where she'd been making notations, and an expression on her face that he would come to recognize as the look she wore when she'd found something significant and was deciding how to explain it. All ready? Sit down, she said without looking up. He sat. Your supplier in Denver, she said, Garfield and Sons. What about them? They've been overcharging you by roughly 12% on every order for the past 2 years. It's not random error. The overcharge is too consistent to be accidental. Someone at that company knows exactly what they're doing. He was still. How much, he asked. I need another hour to finish the full calculation. But at minimum, she tapped the paper. You've lost somewhere between $300 and $400 over 2 years to billing errors that were not errors. The muscle in his jaw moved. Show me, he said. She turned the ledger toward him and walked him through it line by line, figure by figure, patient and precise and completely without condescension, simply showing him the numbers as they actually were rather than as he'd been reading them. When she was done, he sat back. He was quiet for a long time. 2 years, he said. Yes. And nobody was looking closely enough, she said. That's usually how it works. People overcharge when they believe the person being charged isn't going to look. He looked at her. You looked, I always look. Something settled in his expression. Not gratitude exactly, or not only gratitude. Something more like recognition. As though he'd been trying to solve a problem in the dark for a very long time, and someone had finally opened a window. The second ledger, he said. The land parcel records. There's something in there that's bothered me for years, and I've never been able to put my finger on it. She pulled the second ledger toward her. Tell me what bothers you, she said. And he did. He talked, which was apparently not something Nathan Cole did easily or often, based on the slightly self-conscious pauses in his speech, as though he kept expecting himself to stop and was surprised when he didn't, and she listened and asked questions and wrote notes, and slowly the picture of Nathan Cole's financial life and property situation came into focus around her like a landscape emerging from morning fog. The ranch was larger than she'd initially understood. Not just the property immediately around the cabin, but a substantial parcel of mountain land that Nathan had inherited from his father, a man who had apparently acquired it over decades through a combination of legitimate purchase and territorial grants that predated statehood. The documentation was incomplete and scattered across 3 different ledgers and 2 separate file boxes, and Nathan had never had occasion to consolidate it into anything coherent. But even in its scattered state, it was significant. More significant than anyone looking at Nathan Cole's simple mountain cabin and solitary lifestyle would ever guess. She didn't say any of this to him yet. She had the instinct developed over years of working with numbers that had implications for people to understand fully before speaking, to be certain before she committed to a conclusion. But she felt the weight of what she was looking at. How long have you been up here, she asked him, on this land? Born here, he said. My father built this cabin. And you've stayed. I left once. Came back. She didn't ask why. The way he said it closed the question politely but firmly, and she respected closed questions. She had enough of her own. The third ledger, she said. Is that the cattle operation? Cattle and some timber leasing on the north parcel. All right. She squared the ledger in front of her. Give me the morning. He stood up. I'll be at the fence line. I'll come find you when I have something. He nodded and moved toward the door. Mr. Cole, he stopped. The person who's been overcharging you, she said. Do you want to address it, or do you want to let it go? He turned back to look at her. The light from the window caught the side of his face. There was something in his expression, not anger exactly, but a kind of settled certainty. The look of a man who was slow to reach conclusions but arrived at them without ambiguity. I want to address it, he said. Good, she said. Then I'll need to write some letters. He studied her for a moment. You know how to write letters like that? Legal letters. The kind that get a response. I know how to write letters that make people understand that whoever sent them knows exactly what they're looking at and is not interested in being managed, she said. That usually gets a response. For the first time since she'd arrived, something crossed his face that was unmistakably a smile, brief, controlled but real. All right, he said. He walked out. Eliza turned back to the third ledger. Outside, the mountain stood in the early morning light. Enormous and indifferent and entirely unconcerned with the quiet revolution taking place at a kitchen table at the base of their slopes, a woman who had been told she was worthless discovering, page by numbered page, just how much she had to offer. And a man who had been alone long enough to stop wondering whether that would ever change, beginning in the careful, unacknowledged way of people who've been hurt by hope before to wonder. By the time the sun had moved fully into the sky and Nathan came back in for the midday meal, Eliza had 4 pages of notes. She had found the supplier fraud in full detail. She had identified 2 separate instances in the timber leasing agreements, where Nathan was receiving below-market rates from lessees, who had apparently decided the isolated mountain man would never know what his land was worth. She had found a tax overpayment that had been accumulating for 3 years, which meant the county owed Nathan Cole money he didn't know existed. And she had found something else. Something in the land parcel documentation that she hadn't said anything about yet, because she needed to sit with it. To make sure she understood it correctly. To trace every line of the documentation chain back to its source before she attached words to what she was seeing. Because if she was reading it correctly, and she was fairly certain, Nathan Cole was not simply the owner of a modest mountain cattle operation. He was the rightful heir to something considerably larger. And someone, at some point in the recent past, had been trying very carefully not to let him figure that out. She put that page face down beneath the other notes. She would come back to it. When Nathan came through the door and looked at the papers spread across his table with the expression of a man who'd lived alone long enough to find the presence of organized chaos vaguely alarming, she looked up at him and said, "Sit down, I have things to tell you, and some of them are going to make you angry." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat. "Go ahead," he said. She went through the supplier fraud, first laid out every figure, walked him through her methodology, showed him exactly how the pattern worked. His expression didn't change dramatically, but she had already begun to learn how to read the small movements in his face, the slight tightening around the jaw, the almost imperceptible flattening of his mouth that indicated he was processing something that cost him something. $387, she said. That's the conservative figure. The actual number may be higher. And you can prove it, he said. Not a question. I can document every cent of it from your own records. All right. He nodded slowly. What else? She told him about the timber leases, about the tax overpayment. She watched him absorb each piece of information with the same quiet, deliberate processing. He asked precise questions, not angry or scattered, but focused in the way of someone who was deciding what to do, not whether to do anything. When she finished, he sat back. "You've been here one night," he said. "Yes. You did all of this in one morning. The records were there. I just read them carefully." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something she hadn't expected. "In all the years my father kept those books," he said, "and all the years I've kept them since nobody's ever read them carefully." "I know," she said. "Why would you?" He asked, not rhetorically, but genuinely. "You don't know me. You were sent here against your will. You had every reason to do the minimum and wait out the month." Eliza looked down at the papers for a moment. "Because the numbers were wrong," she said. "And numbers that are wrong bother me. It doesn't matter whose they are." He watched her. "It's not just that," she added quietly. "Your father built something here. These ledgers, they're his handwriting for the first 20 years. He worked very hard to hold on to this land. I don't—" She stopped. Considered. Started again. "I don't like seeing someone's life's work drained away by people who thought nobody was paying attention." The silence that followed was the particular kind that has weight in it. Nathan Cole had been alone for a long time. He had gotten very comfortable with silence. He knew all its textures, the silence of the mountains at night, the silence of a long day's work finished, the silence that settled over a man who had learned that most conversations eventually became disappointing. This silence was different. He didn't examine why. "There's something else," she said. He looked at her. "In the land parcel documents," she said. "I want to look at them more carefully before I say anything definite." "But," she paused, "Mr. Cole, has anyone ever approached you about buying this land?" His expression changed. Not dramatically, but something behind his eyes sharpened. "Once," he said. "A man came up here. Said he represented a land development company out of Denver. Made an offer. Below market, he said. Substantial, no. Did he come back?" "He sent letters. 3 of them. I didn't answer." "Do you still have the letters?" He got up without a word, went to the back of the cabin, and returned with a small bundle of envelopes tied with a length of twine. He set them on the table. She untied the twine and opened the first letter. She read it carefully, then the second, then the third. By the time she looked up, Nathan was watching her with the focused attention of someone who had learned to read people the way she read ledgers, looking for the thing beneath the surface, the number that didn't add up. "Who sent these letters?" she asked. "Man named Holloway," he said. "Victor Holloway." She looked at the signature on the third letter. "Mr. Cole," she said, "I think you need to tell me everything you know about Victor Holloway." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, and somewhere in the distance, one of the cattle called out and was answered, and the mountains held their long, enormous silence above all of it. That, Nathan Cole said slowly, is a longer story. "I have time," Eliza said. She turned the letter face down on the table, picked up her pen and looked at him. He began to talk. Nathan Cole was not a man who told his story easily. Eliza understood this within the first 30 seconds of him trying, because she watched him start 3 different sentences and stop each one before it reached its second word, and she recognized the pattern not from evasiveness, but from the particular difficulty of a person who had lived alone with something for so long that the act of translating it into language felt almost physically awkward, like using a muscle that had atrophied from disuse. She didn't rush him. She sat with her pen resting against the paper and her coffee going cold, and she waited the way she'd learned to wait during years of sitting at the edges of conversations that weren't inviting her in, developing patience as a survival skill. Finally, Nathan said, "My father came to this land in 1841. Before statehood," she said. "Before Colorado was a territory," he confirmed. "He came from Kentucky with nothing. He had a horse, and a land grant from the federal government, a small one, just a claim. But he was stubborn, and the mountain suited him. He spent 30 years building on it, piece by piece, buying parcels when men needed to sell and trading labor for land rights when money wasn't available." How much did he accumulate? Nathan was quiet for a moment. By the time he died 12 years ago, the coal land ran from the North Ridge all the way down through the valley on the eastern slope. About 4,000 acres, give or take, most of it forested. Some of it grazable, and there's a water source on the north parcel that runs year-round, a creek that feeds down through 3 other properties before it reaches the valley floor. Eliza's pen had stopped moving. 4,000 acres with a permanent water source in the Colorado mountain country was not a modest inheritance. It was, depending on who wanted it and why, a very significant piece of property. "Does anyone else know the full extent of it?" she asked carefully. "The county assessor has records," Nathan said, "but they're incomplete. My father he didn't trust institutions. He documented what he had to document and kept the rest quiet. Some of the older land agreements were made by handshake, the way things were done back then, and the paperwork." He paused. "The paperwork is in pieces. Some of it's in those ledgers. Some of it's in the boxes in the back room. Some of it my father kept in his head, and I've been trying to reconstruct from memory and from things he told me before he died. So the full picture of what you own has never been formally consolidated." "No, and Victor Holloway," she said. "Tell me about him." Nathan's jaw tightened just slightly. "He showed up 8 months ago. Rode up here alone, which I'll give him credit for. Not many men come this far into the mountains without a reason pressing them hard enough to make the ride worth it. He was well dressed, spoke like a man who'd spent time around lawyers." "What did he say he wanted?" "Said he represented a consortium of Denver investors interested in developing mountain land. Said they were looking to acquire several parcels in this region for a resort project. Hotels, he said, for wealthy people coming west on the railroad who wanted to experience the frontier without the inconvenience of actually living in it." Liza made his offer, 60 cents on the dollar. "Maybe less. I didn't negotiate far enough to find out the actual bottom." He offered 60 cents on the dollar for 4,000 acres of mountain land with a year-round water source. "Yes. And when you said no," he smiled, Nathan said, and there was something flat and precise in the way he said it. The smile had clearly told him something he'd filed away. "He said I should think about it, that the offer was generous and wouldn't stay on the table forever. That land like this was only going to get harder to hold on to as development came west." "A threat dressed as advice," Eliza said. "That's what it sounded like to me." "And the letters?" The first one repeated the offer with slightly more formal language. The second one mentioned obliquely that there were some questions about the validity of some of the older land grants in this region. That the federal documentation on pre-territorial claims had been reviewed, and some of them hadn't survived scrutiny. Eliza looked up from her notes. "He was telling you your ownership might be challengeable." "He was suggesting it," Nathan said, without saying it outright. The third letter was milder, almost friendly, as if the second one hadn't happened. "He said he was still interested, that the offer remained, and that he hoped I was keeping well." The third letter was him recalibrating, she said. The second one was too aggressive and he knew it. He pulled back to see if you'd take the friendlier approach. Nathan looked at her steadily. You've seen this kind of thing before. I've seen men who use contracts and correspondence the way other men use weapons, she said. You learn to read the rhythm of it. She picked up the third letter again and read through it one more time, slowly, paying attention not to what it said, but to the gaps, the things it carefully didn't say, the questions it raised without asking. The particular shape of language designed to make a man feel uncertain about what he owned without ever giving him anything concrete to argue against. He's not a resort developer, she said. Nathan was still. Or he may have resort development as part of what he does, she continued, but that's not what this is. A legitimate resort developer offers fair market value because they need the deal to close. They have investors, timelines, construction commitments. They don't have the luxury of playing the long game with a reluctant seller. Holloway has been working on you for 8 months with no urgency. He's not on a developer's schedule. Then what's his schedule? She set the letter down. That's what I need to find out. The north parcel with the water source, can you show me exactly where it sits relative to the valley properties below? He got up, went to the back room, and came back with a hand-drawn map made by his father, the lines faded and some of the notations barely legible. He spread it on the table between them. She studied it. He watched her study it. And it was in that moment, the two of them leaning over his father's hand-drawn map in the late afternoon light, her pen moving in small, careful notations, and his eyes following her thinking, with a focus he hadn't given anything in years, that something shifted in the room. Not dramatically. Not in any way that would have been visible to an observer. But it shifted. Like the way temperature changes before a storm, not the storm itself, but the air knowing something is coming. The creek, she said. If someone controlled this water source, how many properties in the valley would be affected? He thought about it. 7, maybe 8 ranches. The Miller place. The Hawthorns. The 2 Delgado brothers have parcels down the slope. A few smaller homesteads further east. And if this water source was diverted, or if the land around it was purchased and the access restricted. Nathan's expression changed. Something moved behind his eyes that was cold and clear and not quite anger yet, but in the same family. Those ranchers would have a very hard time surviving a dry summer, he said. Yes, Eliza said they would. She straightened up. Looked at him directly. Mr. Cole, I think Victor Holloway is not interested in building a resort. I think he's interested in controlling water access in this valley. And I think your land, specifically the north parcel, is the key to that control. If he acquires it from you at 60 cents on the dollar, he can restrict water access to every downstream property, which gives him leverage to purchase those properties at similarly depressed prices, which gives him everything, Nathan said quietly. A very large amount of very valuable land, she said. Yes, the silence that followed was the kind that carries mass. Nathan sat back in his chair. He put one hand flat on the table and looked at it for a moment, a large, scarred, working man's hand, the kind that had spent decades in honest contact with the physical world, and she watched him absorb the scope of what she'd just laid out. He's been doing this to other people, he said. It was not quite a question. That would be my guess. This level of strategy, the low offer, the implied threat about documentation validity, the patient follow-up, this isn't improvised. This is a man who's done this before and knows how long it takes. And the valley ranchers, he said. Do they know? Almost certainly not. They'd have no reason to connect their individual situations to a coordinated effort. Each of them would just see their own problems: a hard season, a water shortage, a buyer who showed up at the right time with an offer. Nathan was quiet for a long moment. I've lived on this land my whole life, he said. My father is buried on this land. The Millers have been in that valley since before I can remember. The Delgado boys, their grandfather, helped my father mark the boundary lines when he first claimed this parcel. I know, she said, though she'd only known him for a day. She said it the way you say it, when the meaning doesn't require evidence. What do we do, he asked. And it was such a simple question, and he'd asked it in such a direct and straightforward way. Not what do I do, but what do we do? as though her presence at this table had been assumed into his thinking as naturally as breathing, that Eliza had to take a moment before she answered. First, she said, we establish the full legal extent of your ownership. Everything documented, consolidated, properly filed. We close every gap in the record that Holloway could use to create doubt. We make the documentation so complete and so airtight that his suggestion in that second letter becomes genuinely laughable. How long will that take? Weeks. Maybe longer. Some of these older grants will need verification from Federal Land Office records. We'll need to write to Denver, possibly to Washington. And in the meantime, she said, you don't sell. You don't respond to any further correspondence from Holloway. And you say nothing to anyone in town about what we've found. He looked at her sharply. Why the last part? Because if Holloway has been operating in this region for long enough to have developed this strategy, he may have sources of information in town. People who hear things and pass them along. I don't know that, but I don't want to assume otherwise. Nathan held her gaze. You think like someone who's been burned by trusting the wrong person. I think like someone who learned to read a situation before assuming it's what it appears to be, she said. Those aren't the same thing, he nodded slowly. All right. We do it your way. She gathered the letters into a neat stack. I'll start on the land documentation tomorrow, but I need you to go through those boxes in the back room with me. I can read the records, but you're the one who knows the context. There will be things in there that only make sense with your father's history behind them. Tonight? He asked. Tonight I need you to sleep, she said, and the directness of it surprised them both slightly, the easy authority of it, the way it landed not as an order but as simple, reasonable fact. You've been working since before I woke up this morning. Tired men make poor witnesses to their own memories. Tomorrow, he almost smiled again. You've been here one day, he said. I know. You're telling me when to sleep. I'm telling you when to sleep, she agreed, without apology. He stood, shook his head slightly, not in irritation but in something that might have been, if you were watching for it, a quiet and uncomplicated form of appreciation, and picked up his coffee cup. Tomorrow, he said. Tomorrow, she confirmed. She was already turning back to the ledger. He watched her for a moment longer than was necessary, then went to bank the fire for the night. What followed was not a quiet week. It was a week of Eliza Morgan working with the sustained, focused intensity of a person who has finally been given something worth working on. And Nathan Cole slowly discovering that the woman his neighbor's father had discarded was possibly the most capable person who had ever sat at his kitchen table. Every morning she was at the books before he finished his first chores. Every evening she stayed at the table after he'd gone to bed, working by lamplight, cross-referencing documents, writing letters in the clean, precise hand of someone who knew that the formal English of legal correspondence was its own kind of language and had taught herself to speak it. She found things. She found a federal land grant from 1849 that extended the Cole claim significantly further north than Nathan. His father had acquired it in a trade and filed it in the wrong box, and apparently never mentioned it to anyone. She found a water rights declaration from 1858 that was worth, in the current legal climate, considerably more than the land it was attached to. She found evidence that a 1863 tax assessment on the eastern parcel had been calculated using the wrong acreage, which meant Nathan had been overpaying taxes on one parcel and underpaying on another for over a decade, and the discrepancy would need to be addressed carefully to avoid either liability or the appearance of evasion. Each discovery she brought to Nathan. She explained it without condescension and without impatience, and she answered his questions with the same quality of attention, whether the question was simple or complex. And she noticed, though she said nothing about noticing, that his questions grew more sophisticated as the days passed. He was learning alongside her. Not the specifics of legal record-keeping, which was her territory, but the larger logic, the way these things connected, the patterns of how land and money and power moved through documents that most people never read. He was sharp. She'd known he was capable from the first day. You don't survive alone in the mountains for years without a functional intelligence, but capability in the physical world didn't always translate to capability with abstract systems. Nathan translated easily. He had the kind of mind that, once shown a structure, could navigate it independently. She respected that more than she'd expected to. They fell into rhythms without discussing them. He left coffee on the stove when he went out in the mornings. She left supper ready when he came in at evening. They ate together and talked about the work, always the documents and the strategy, and the questions she'd generated during the day, and then he asked her, sometimes, about things she hadn't expected him to ask about. Not about her father or her history, which she appreciated, but about her thinking. How did you know, he asked one evening midway through the week, that the supplier was overcharging deliberately rather than making mistakes? The consistency, she said, genuine errors scatter. They're different amounts, different directions, sometimes in the customer's favor, sometimes not. Deliberate overcharging has a pattern. It's always within a range that seems plausible, it always goes one direction, and it always stays below the threshold that would make a reasonable person stop and formally question it. Below the threshold, he repeated. Whoever was doing it at Garfield and Sons had calculated the amount carefully enough that it looked like variance. Small enough to dismiss as normal business fluctuation. Large enough to add up to several $100s over 2 years. Patient, she agreed. That's the common thread. The supplier fraud. Holloway's approach. Patient incremental, designed to accumulate results before the target realizes what's happening. He was quiet. Then, you said the supplier fraud was someone at Garfield and Sons. Not the company. Almost certainly one person. The pattern is too consistent to be systemic. A systemic overcharge would have some variation from different people handling different orders. This reads like one person, same hand, same calculation each time. And Holloway, do you think he knows people at Garfield and Sons? Eliza put down her pen. She looked at him. Because the truth was, she had been thinking about that exact question for 2 days and hadn't said it aloud because she didn't want to present a theory she hadn't yet substantiated. And Nathan had arrived at it, independently, through nothing but the logic she'd laid out for him. I don't know, she said. But I think it's worth finding out. How? I know someone in Denver, she said. A woman I used to correspond with. Her husband worked for a law firm that handled land disputes. She may know Holloway's name. She may know who he's worked with before. A woman you used to correspond with, he said, carefully. Without any inflection that suggested he was making a point, but making one nonetheless. Eliza understood what he was noting. That she had connections, history, a network of relationships that her father had never thought to wonder about, because he'd never considered that she moved through the world in any meaningful way beyond his household. My father believed my world ended at his property line, she said simply. He was wrong about that, the same way he was wrong about most things. Nathan nodded. I already did, yesterday morning. He paused. Then, with something in his expression that was somewhere between amusement and genuine respect, anything else you've already handled that I should know about? I wrote to the Federal Land Office in Denver regarding the 1,849 grant. I wrote to the County Tax Office requesting a formal review of the assessment discrepancy. And I wrote to a former judge in Crestfield, a man named Aldrich who retired from the circuit court 3 years ago, to ask whether he'd be willing to review the documentation chain on your father's original land claims for legal sufficiency. Nathan stared at her. You've been here 8 days, he said. 9, she said. The 9th day starts tomorrow. And you've done all of that. The letters are on the shelf by the door. You can read them if you'd like. He stood up. He walked to the shelf. He stood there for a moment, looking at the small, neat stack of sealed envelopes, each one addressed in her clean hand to a different name in a different town. Then he turned around. Eliza. It was the first time he'd used her given name. She registered it without letting it show on her face. Mr. Cole Nathan, he said. If we're going to be building a legal case together, you should probably call me Nathan. She looked at him for a moment. Nathan, she said. He nodded, came back to the table. Sat down. Tell me about the judge, he said. Aldrich. Why him specifically? Because he's retired and has no reason to be influenced by current county politics. Because his reputation for integrity on the circuit court was strong enough that I've heard it referenced by people who had no reason to flatter him. And because she paused, he once wrote a dissenting opinion in a territorial land dispute that I read in my father's law correspondence files. His reasoning was meticulous. He understands how pre-territorial grants work, and he understands the specific challenges of establishing continuous ownership on mountain land. You read your father's law correspondence files. My father left them in the study where anyone could access them, she said. I was curious. Nathan looked at her with the expression she was beginning to recognize as the one he wore when he was recalibrating his understanding of something. Updating his picture of who she was and what she'd been doing all those years in a house that had no idea what was sitting at its edges. Your father, he said quietly, is an idiot. It came out matter of fact. Not mean, just accurate, offered without drama, the way Nathan offered most true things. Eliza laughed. It surprised her. It came up without warning, genuine and unguarded. And it surprised him too. She could see it in his face, not the laugh itself, but the specific quality of it, the way it was completely unperformed. The laugh of a person who rarely felt safe enough to be unguarded and had just found a moment where they could. Yes, she said when it had passed, he is. After that, something was slightly easier between them. Not romantic or not yet, not in any way either of them would have named, but easier in the fundamental of two people who have discovered they can tell each other the truth without careful management of how it lands. On the 11th day, the letter arrived. It came with a rider from town, a boy from the postal station, who made the mountain run twice a week and had apparently been told this delivery was time-sensitive. Nathan paid him and brought the letter inside without opening it, because it was addressed to Eliza, and he was a man who understood that mail addressed to one person was not opened by another. She recognized the handwriting on the envelope immediately. Denver, Colorado. Her old correspondent. She broke the seal and read it standing at the table, and Nathan watched her face as she read, and he was good enough at watching faces by now to see exactly the moment when the letter stopped being just information and became something more serious. What is it? She looked up. Victor Holloway, she said. Catherine knows the name. Her husband's firm handled a land dispute involving him 4 years ago. In New Mexico territory. The same kind, she said. A water source. Mountain land with a creek feeding downstream properties. Holloway acquired the upstream parcel for less than market value. The seller didn't understand what he was signing. Catherine's husband believed, or was under some kind of pressure we couldn't establish legally, and within 2 years he'd used that control to force 3 valley ranches into financial difficulty and bought them out at 20 cents on the dollar. Nathan was very still. Did he face any legal consequences? He asked. No, she said, because each transaction was technically legal. The original seller signed. The downstream ranchers sold voluntarily. They had to by that point or lose everything. Nothing was done with a gun. It was all done with documents. It's calculation of a man who understood that most people will eventually surrender to a slow squeeze they can't identify the source of. She put the letter down on the table. She put both hands flat on the table on either side of it. She looked at Nathan. He's going to come back, she said. It won't be letters next time. He'll escalate. He knows you haven't responded, and he'll interpret that as resistance, and men like Holloway don't accept resistance, they find a lever. What kind of lever? Something about the documentation. He mentioned in that second letter that some pre-territorial claims hadn't survived scrutiny. That was not a random comment. He's going to try to create doubt about the validity of your ownership. Not enough to win in court necessarily, but enough to make fighting it expensive and exhausting. He wants me to decide it's not worth the trouble. He wants you to decide that selling to him for 60 cents is easier than years of legal uncertainty, she said. And for most people, that calculation would eventually work. Because most people don't have the resources to sustain a legal fight indefinitely. She looked at him directly. But we're going to close every gap in your documentation before he gets the chance to question it, she said. And we're going to do it quietly enough that when he makes his move, we're already ready. Nathan looked at her for a long moment. When you say we, he said. We, she said. You came here for 1 month. I know, the month is half over, I know that too. It was quiet, the fire crackled. Outside, the wind had picked up and was moving through the pines with that sound that always made the cabin feel more interior, more defined, more like a place that existed in deliberate opposition to the indifference of the mountains around it. Eliza, don't, she said, not unkindly. He stopped. Don't tell me I don't have to stay, she said. Don't make it complicated. I'm choosing to stay because this work matters, and it isn't finished, and I don't leave things unfinished. She picked up her pen. Now, the letter from Judge Aldrich should arrive within the week. While we wait, I want to go through the back room boxes and locate the original survey documentation from your father's first claim. He looked at her for one more moment. Then he pushed back from the table and stood. The boxes are heavy, he said. I'll carry them. I know you will, she said. He went to get the boxes. She turned back to the ledger. The work continued. And underneath it, steady as the creek running through the north parcel that neither of them had yet said aloud was the real prize. Something else was building, quieter than the legal case. Slower than the strategy, but no less certain in its direction. Two people, each carrying the weight of being misunderstood for long enough that they'd stopped expecting to be known, were discovering carefully, without announcement, in the space between one true thing said and another, that they were in fact knowable. And that discovery, for both of them, was more frightening and more necessary than anything Victor Holloway could threaten. Judge Aldrich's letter arrived on a Thursday. Eliza knew it was important before she opened it, because the envelope was heavier than a simple reply, and the seal was pressed with the kind of deliberate care that men of legal background reserved for correspondence they intended to stand behind. She broke it open at the kitchen table, while Nathan stood near the stove with his coffee, watching her without pretending he wasn't. She read it twice before she said anything. He'll do it, she said. Nathan set down his cup. He'll review the documentation. More than that. She looked up. He says the 1,849 grant I found is legitimate, and he recognizes the issuing authority. He says if the documentation chain is as complete as my letter suggested, he believes the coal claim is not only valid but substantially stronger than anything a challenge based on pre-territorial ambiguity could overcome. She paused. He also says he knows Victor Holloway's name. Nathan went very still. From where? He doesn't say directly. He says, and I'm reading his exact words, that he is aware of certain land acquisition activities in the Southern Territories connected to that name, and that if Mr. Cole is dealing with that party, he would strongly recommend ensuring all documentation is formally filed and publicly recorded before any further contact is made. Nathan pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. He's warning us, Nathan said. He's warning us, Eliza confirmed. Aldrich is a careful man. He won't say what he can't prove. But he wouldn't have included that if it didn't matter. How soon can we file? I need 2 more weeks to consolidate everything properly. Filing incomplete documentation would be worse than waiting. It creates gaps that can be exploited. She set the letter down. But Nathan, we need to talk about the Valley Ranchers. He looked at her. If Holloway is already moving, if he's been in this region long enough to have sent you 3 letters, and is now escalating, there's a reasonable chance he's already made contact with some of the downstream properties. The Millers, the Delgados. You think he's working them at the same time he's working me? I think he's patient but not idle, she said. And I think we need to know what's happening in that valley before we find out the hard way. Nathan was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. She'd come to recognize that gesture. It was what he did when he was deciding something he'd already mostly decided, and was just giving himself the courtesy of a moment before committing to it. I'll ride down to the Miller place tomorrow, he said. Don't tell them everything, she said. Not yet. Just listen. Find out if anyone's approached them. Find out if there's been any trouble with the water this season. I know how to listen without talking, he said, and there was a dry edge to it that made her press her lips together against a smile. I know you do, she said. He left before dawn the next morning and was back by mid-afternoon, and Eliza knew from the way he came through the door not his usual quiet entry, but with a purposefulness that carried tension in it that he'd found something. Sit, she said, pushing the ledger aside. He sat. He put his hat on the table. He looked at her with the expression of a man who'd ridden down a mountain expecting to find a problem and had found something considerably worse. Tom Miller, he said. He got a visit 6 weeks ago. Man came to the ranch, said he was surveying water rights for the county. Asked Tom questions about the creek, how consistent the flow was, whether it had ever run dry in a drought year, what his water usage was for livestock. A survey, Eliza said flatly, no official paperwork. Tom didn't ask for any because the man was well-dressed and talked like someone with authority, and Tom trusted that if the county sent someone, the county had its reasons. And the Delgados? Roberto Delgado, youngest son, answered the door for a man who came asking similar questions 2 months ago. Different man, Roberto thinks, based on the description. But the same questions. Eliza stood up. She didn't pace, she wasn't a pacer, but she moved to the shelf and stood with her back to him for a moment, working through it. He sent surveyors before he sent letters, she said. He was building a picture of the water dependency before he approached you. He needed to know how many properties relied on the creek, how critical the dependency was, before he could calculate the leverage. Eliza. Something in his voice made her turn. Roberto Delgado's oldest son, Miguel, he works part-time in Crestfield. At the general store, Nathan held her gaze. He told Roberto that a man named Holloway has been coming through Crestfield regularly for the past 4 months. Meeting with people. Which people? He doesn't know specifically, but one of them is the county land assessor. The room went quiet in a way that had wit to it. The county land assessor. The man responsible for the official records of who owned what, how much it was worth, and what taxes were owed on it. He's buying influence at the county level, Eliza said. If he controls the assessor, he controls the official record. He can create discrepancies, flag documentation for review, delay filings, introduce questions about validity that look like they're coming from neutral process when they're actually coming from him. She pressed one hand flat against the shelf. Nathan, we have less time than I thought. How much less? I don't know, but we need to move the filing timeline up. She turned fully to face him. I need you to ride to Denver. He blinked. Denver. The federal land office. The filings need to happen at the federal level, not just the county level. The 1,849 grant is a federal document, which means it falls under federal jurisdiction, which means the county assessor has no authority over it. She was already moving back to the table, pulling papers. If we file at the federal level first and get the acknowledgement back, before Holloway can interfere at the county level, we establish a record that supersedes anything he can do locally. That's a 3-day ride, I know, which means you'd be here alone. She looked at him steadily. I'm aware of that. He looked back at her with something in his expression that she couldn't immediately read, not doubt in her capability. She was fairly certain of that, but something more personal. Something that had to do with the fact that in 3 weeks, she had become the kind of person whose presence in this cabin he had stopped being able to imagine the absence of. He doesn't know about you, Nathan said. Holloway? He doesn't know you're here. He thinks he's dealing with a lone mountain cowboy who doesn't understand contracts. If he finds out that there's someone here who's been going through the documentations, then we don't let him find out, she said. You leave quietly. You take the northern trail that doesn't go through Crestfield. You file the documents in Denver and you come back. I keep working here, nobody knows, and if he comes while I'm gone? She picked up her pen. Then I'll deal with it, she said. Eliza Nathan. She said his name the way he'd said hers, direct, without softness but without hardness either, the tone of someone who needed to be taken seriously and knew it. I survived 26 years in a house where no one believed I had value. I managed my father's finances without him knowing for 7 years. I walked 3 days alone through mountain wilderness with 2 bags and $40. And I did not fall apart. She held his gaze. I can manage a ranch for 3 days. He was quiet for a long moment. I'll leave at first light tomorrow, he said. Good. There's a rifle above the door. I know where it is. The Millers are 3 miles down the South Trail. If anything, he stopped. Go to Denver, she said. File the documents. Come nodded. And then he did something she hadn't expected. He reached across the table and put his hand briefly over hers. One single moment of contact, the weight of a large working hand resting on top of hers for just a breath's length of time. Not romantic in its execution, but in its honesty, a man who didn't touch things carelessly, touching something he cared about. Then he took his hand back and stood up. I'll get the documents ready to take, he said. They're already organized, she said, on the right side of the shelf tied with the blue cord. He almost smiled. He went to get them. She turned back to her work, and she did not let herself sit with the feeling of his hand over hers for longer than it took her to pick up her pen. There was too much to do. He left before sunrise the next morning. She heard him in the barn, saddling his horse, moving with the quiet efficiency of a man who had ridden out in the dark many times. She lay in the back room and listened to the sounds of him going and did not come out, because coming out to say goodbye felt like it would have meant something she wasn't prepared to name yet. The sound of hoofbeats faded up the northern trail. The cabin was very quiet. She got up, she built the fire, made coffee, sat at the table with the remaining documents and worked. The first day passed without incident. The second day brought a cold rain that kept the cattle restless and close to the barn, and Eliza spent 2 hours in the late afternoon moving through the mud to check on them, because they were Nathan's cattle, and she was responsible for them, and she had never in her life been responsible for anything that was entirely dependent on her. And she found, somewhat to her surprise, that she did not resent it. She found she wanted to do it well. The third day, Victor Holloway came. She heard the horse before she heard anything else, a single rider, moving at a pace that communicated confidence rather than urgency. She was at the table. She put her pen down. She did not go to the window. She waited. The knock at the door was measured and polite. She took a breath. She opened the door. Victor Holloway was not what she'd constructed in her imagination. She'd built him from his letters, the controlled language, the layered implications, the calculated friendliness of the third correspondence, and she'd expected something cold and obviously predatory. The way people sometimes expected snakes to rattle before they struck. He was instead pleasant-looking, somewhere in his 50s, well-dressed but not ostentatiously so, with an easy smile that had clearly been developed through long practice into something that resembled warmth without actually producing any. He had the eyes of a man who was always calculating, but he'd learned to keep that calculation one layer beneath the surface where most people couldn't see it. Eliza could see it. "Good afternoon," he said, and his gaze moved over her with one quick professional sweep, noting her, categorizing her, deciding in approximately 2 seconds what category of person she was and how she should be handled. "I'm looking for Nathan Cole. Is he available?" "He's not here," she said. "Ah," Holloway's expression adjusted smoothly into polite disappointment. "I'm Victor Holloway. I have some business with Mr. Cole. We've been in correspondence. And you are?" "Eliza," she said.
She gave no Mr. for...
"I manage his household and his accounts," she said. Something moved in Holloway's eyes, so brief she almost missed it. A recalibration. "How fortunate for him," Holloway said with a warmth designed to make her feel that he found her too threatening and useful only as a conduit. "Do you know when he might return?" "I don't," she said. "He didn't leave a timeline." "I see." Holloway glanced past her into the cabin, not obviously, but deliberately, the practiced half-look of someone gathering information without appearing to. "I don't suppose you might give him a message? I can do that. Please tell him Victor Holloway stopped by, and that I'm staying at the hotel in Crestfield this week, and I'd very much like to have a conversation with him about the land acquisition proposal I mentioned in my letters." Tell him, and I say this as a friend, not as a negotiating position, that the window for the offer I've extended is not indefinitely open. There are other properties in the region we're considering. I'd hate for Mr. Cole to miss an opportunity simply because of timing. Eliza looked at him. She held the look just long enough to be slightly uncomfortable, not aggressive, not hostile, but the particular look of someone who has heard exactly what was said and also exactly what was meant. I'll tell him you came by, she said. Holloway studied her for just a moment longer than the conversation required. You manage his accounts, he said, returning to it. Testing something, yes. Then perhaps you're in a position to understand the financial logic of the offer, he said, and his tone shifted not by much but enough. From the warmth aimed at an inconsequential woman to something more considered. More direct. A fair offer at the right moment is worth considerably more than the theoretical value of a piece of land that cost money every year to hold and maintain. Remote mountain property, even well-situated property, is not liquid. You can't eat acreage. You can't pay debts with a water source. He was not talking to a housekeeper anymore. He was talking to whoever she actually was, or at least to his estimate of it. Mr. Cole's financial situation is his own business, she said evenly. Of course, the smile returned. Of course it is. I meant no presumption. I simply, as I said, I'd hate for timing to become an obstacle. He touched the brim of his hat. Please do give him my message, I will. He looked at her one more time. Something in the look was not the casual appraisal of the first assessment. It was sharper, more focused. The look of a man who had walked into a situation he'd expected to find empty, and had instead found something he hadn't accounted for. Good day, he said. Good day, Mr. Holloway. She watched him ride out. She stood in the doorway until the sound of his horse faded completely. Then she went inside, sat at the table, picked up her pen, and wrote down every word of the conversation from memory, including the pauses, the shifts in tone, the moment his eyes had moved past her into the cabin, the precise phrasing of the warning about the window closing. When she was done, she set the pen down. She sat for a moment in the quiet. He knew she wasn't just a housekeeper. He hadn't said it, but he knew. And because he knew, the calculation had changed. A lone mountain cowboy with a housekeeper was one thing. A lone mountain cowboy with someone who managed his accounts and could hold a conversation without flinching was another. He would come back. Not this week, probably. He'd go back to Crestfield and reconsider his approach. But he would come back, which meant she needed Nathan home before that happened. She turned to a clean piece of paper and wrote him a letter, which she knew she couldn't send since he was on the road, but she wrote it anyway because the act of writing it helped her think. And when Nathan walked through the door 2 evenings later, dusty, tired, with the particular look of a man who'd ridden hard in both directions, she handed it to him before he'd taken off his hat. He read it standing up. His expression didn't change dramatically, but she watched the slow, deliberate tightening of his jaw as he worked through each line, and when he got to the bottom and looked up at her, his eyes had something in them that was past anger and into the territory of decided. He came here while I was gone, he said. Yes. You talked to him alone. I did. And he stopped. Read through the letter once more. Looked up again. You held the line. I told him nothing. I gave him nothing. I confirmed nothing. She met his eyes. But Nathan, he knows I'm not just keeping house. He looked at me and he recalculated. He's going to come back with a different approach. The filings went through, Nathan said. The Federal Land Office accepted everything. The clerk gave me a receipt and an acknowledgement it's already in the federal record. The relief that moved through her was physical. She felt it in her shoulders, which had apparently been braced for days without her full awareness. Both grants? She asked. Both grants, the 1,849 and the Water Rights Declaration. Formally filed, officially acknowledged, federal record. He reached into his coat and produced the papers, 2 receipts, stamped and dated, in the hand of a Federal Land Office clerk. He set them on the table between them. She picked them up. Read them carefully, set them down. He can't touch these, she said. No, Nathan said. He can't. They stood on opposite sides of the table, with the documents between them and the fire behind them, and the weight of what they'd built in 3 weeks settled around them like something solid and permanent. "He's going to find another way," she said. "I know. He has the county assessor. He has patience. He'll look for something we missed." "Is there something we missed?" She looked at him. "I don't believe so. But I want to go through everything one more time." Fresh eyes. "Starting tomorrow," he agreed. He hung up his hat. He went to the stove and poured himself the coffee that had been sitting there for hours and was approximately the consistency of road tar by now, and he drank it without complaint. She sat back down at the table. "He said something else," she said. "When he was here." Nathan looked at her. "Before he left, he said something about remote mountain property being hard to hold. That you can't pay debts with a water source." She paused. "Nathan, does anyone have a claim on any debt involving this property? Anything your father might have left? Any outstanding obligations that could be used as leverage?" The silence that followed lasted just a beat too long. She caught it, Nathan. He set down his coffee cup. "There was a loan," he said, 17 years ago. My father borrowed money to buy the eastern parcel, the largest single piece. The lender was a man named Gideon Cross. Cross died 10 years ago, and my father believed the debt died with him because he'd never been able to locate any heirs, and the loan document he stopped. "The loan document," she said carefully. "My father believed it was destroyed," Nathan said. "In a fire. At Cross's property in 1869. She looked at him steadily. "Did he see it destroyed?" she asked. Nathan didn't answer immediately. Which was its own answer. "How much was the loan?" she asked. $400, with interest accumulated over 17 years. "It could be called in for considerably more than that," she said. "Depending on the terms. And if someone had acquired the original loan document, if it survived the fire, or if a copy existed somewhere, they'd have a legal claim against the property," Nathan said. His voice was flat in the way that something goes flat when the person speaking it has just seen the full shape of something they hadn't wanted to look at directly. "Nathan." She kept her voice even. "I need to see everything related to that loan. Everything your father kept. Every piece of paper, every notation, all of them," she said. "Tonight." He brought the boxes. They worked through them together at the kitchen table, Nathan opening boxes and handing her folders. Eliza working through each one with the speed and precision of someone who had spent the past 3 weeks training her eyes on exactly this type of documentation. The fire burned lower. The night settled in around the cabin. Neither of them mentioned stopping. At somewhere past midnight, Eliza found it. Not the original loan document. Not a copy of it. Something worse. A letter, hidden in the back of a folder behind a collection of old receipts, clearly overlooked by Nathan when he'd gone through these boxes years ago, or perhaps simply set aside by his father in a moment of hope-driven denial. It was dated 1871. It was from a lawyer in Santa Fe. And it referenced the Cross loan by number, by amount, and by terms, which meant a record existed somewhere in Santa Fe of exactly what was owed and to whom. She read it 3 times. Then she looked at Nathan. "Your father knew," she said quietly. "He knew the loan record wasn't destroyed. He received this letter 2 years after the fire. He kept it." Nathan took the letter, read it, set it down, pressed one hand flat against the table. She watched him work through it, the weight of his father's fear, the years of silence, the choice to hope that it would simply stay buried. "He did the best he could," Nathan said finally, "and it came out rough in the way that things come out rough when they've been held very still for a long time. He didn't have someone to help him read these things." "I know," she said. "Can it be fixed?" She looked at the letter. "At the date, at the reference number. It depends on whether anyone has located that Santa Fe record," she said. "If Holloway's people have been thorough, if they've been researching your father's full financial history, I've been researching his land records, they may already know this exists. And if they have leverage," she said. "The kind that doesn't require guns or threats. The kind that comes with a lawyer and a document and a calm explanation that the debt is being called in and the property is the collateral." Nathan was very still. She looked at him at the exhaustion in his face from 3 days of hard riding and a long night of going through boxes, at the weight of a history that his father had tried to protect him from, and had instead passed forward intact. At the particular solitude of a man who had been carrying things alone for so long that the carrying had become invisible to him. "Nathan," she said. He looked at her. "Your father didn't have someone to help him read these things," she said. "But you do." He held her gaze. "I'm going to write to Santa Fe in the morning," she said. "I'm going to find out the current legal status of that debt. And we are going to deal with it properly, legally, completely before Victor Holloway has the opportunity to use it. What if he's already found it? Then we deal with that too." I make it sound like a problem that can be solved," she said, "because problems that can be solved should sound that way. It keeps you from surrendering to them before the fight has started." He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the wind was moving through the pines, and the fire was very low, and the mountains were doing what mountains do at night, holding their enormous silence over everything, indifferent and permanent. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. Not the way he might have asked it 2 weeks ago, with distance, with appropriate unfamiliarity. He asked it the way a man asks something when he needs the true answer, and he's prepared to hear it. She thought about her father at his desk. She thought about the door closing. She thought about walking 3 days alone through the mountains with everything she owned, and the sound of the wind and the cold, and the particular freedom of a woman who has nothing left to lose, and therefore nothing left to be afraid of. "Because it matters," she said. "This land, those people in the valley, the work your father did, it matters. And because," she paused, "because I have spent my entire life knowing things and having no place to use them." And she gestured at the papers, the boxes, the letters, the documentation chain they'd been building together. "This is a place." Nathan Cole looked at Eliza Morgan across a table covered in papers that represented his life's foundation and his father's life's work, and the threat of a man who believed that patience and money could eventually wear down any resistance. And he thought, not this time, not while she's at this table. "Get some sleep," he said. "You too," she said. Neither of them moved immediately. The fire crackled once and settled, and in the silence that followed, something that had been building steadily for 3 weeks between two people who were too careful and too scarred to name settled into something it couldn't be unsettled from. The letter to Santa Fe went out the next morning. Eliza wrote it herself, in the formal legal English she had taught herself from her father's borrowed correspondence files, and she addressed it to the Territorial Land Records Office with a request for verification of any outstanding debt instruments registered under the name Gideon Cross, cross-referenced against the coal land parcel in Colorado. She kept the language precise and neutral, the language of someone conducting routine due diligence, rather than someone racing against an opponent she hadn't yet fully identified. She handed it to Nathan without ceremony. "Take it to town yourself," she said. "Don't send the postal rider, and don't stop to talk to anyone." He took it, looked at her. "You think he has someone watching?" "I think a man who has the county assessor in his pocket thinks carefully about information flow," she said. "Yes." He rode to town and back in under 4 hours, which told her he hadn't stopped, and she felt something release in her chest when she heard his horse come back up the trail. That evening they ate together in the particular quiet of two people who have a great deal to say to each other, and are both, for different reasons, being careful about how much of it they allow out at once. The work was the safe territory. They talked about the work. "I've been thinking about the assessor," Eliza said. Nathan looked up from his plate. If Holloway has influence over him, it means he's been feeding the assessor information or instructions about specific properties. Which means the assessor has been doing things with official records that aren't legitimate. She set down her fork. "Nathan, that's not just corruption that affects us. That's corruption that affects every property owner in this county who's had any official assessment in the past, however long Holloway has been operating here." He was very still. "If we could document it," she said, "it becomes a much larger case. Not just Nathan Cole defending his land. Federal interference in county land records. Conspiracy to defraud multiple property owners. You're talking about going after Holloway on a broader front, he said. I'm talking about making the fight too big for him to contain, she said. Right now he thinks he's dealing with one man on a mountain. If we can demonstrate a pattern, the same methods, the same results, different properties, he's not dealing with a personal dispute anymore. He's dealing with a federal investigation. Nathan looked at her with the expression she had come to think of as his thinking face, the slight stillness, the focused quality of his attention, the sense of a man running calculations that weren't mathematical but weren't less precise for that. The New Mexico Territory case, he said. The one Catherine Marsh mentioned. If there are records of that land dispute, formal records, court filings, they would show the same pattern. Survey without authorization, implied threats about documentation validity, debt leverage if available, coordinated acquisition of downstream properties once water access was controlled. She put both hands flat on the table. Nathan, I think Holloway has done this at least twice before. Possibly more. And I think if we can connect the methods, prove the pattern, we can bring in federal authority rather than fighting this at the county level, where he already has influence. How do we get the New Mexico records? Catherine Marsh's husband's firm handled the dispute. I'm going to write to her again, not asking for information this time, asking whether her husband would be willing to provide formal documentation of what he witnessed. She paused. It's a significant ask. He'd be putting himself in opposition to a man who has demonstrated he doesn't respond well to obstacles. Then why would he do it? Eliza looked at him steadily. Because I'm going to explain to Catherine exactly what this man has done and what he's planning to do, and I'm going to trust that she and her husband are people who find that unacceptable. She paused. I was right to trust her once. I'm going to trust her again. Nathan nodded slowly. Write the letter, he said. She already had the paper out. 3 days later, two things happened simultaneously, and the collision of them hit the cabin like a weather front. The first thing was a rider from town, not the regular postal boy, but a man Eliza didn't recognize, well-dressed in a way that suggested he worked for someone, rather than for himself. He handed her an envelope and rode away without speaking. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper with precise legal language that she read standing in the doorway with the cold morning air on her face and felt her stomach drop through the floor. It was a formal notice of debt claim, filed in the name of a legal entity called Mountain Western Land Holdings, claiming to have acquired the rights to the Giddon Cross loan against the Cole Eastern parcel. The notice cited the original loan amount, $400 from $1,859, plus 17 years of compounded interest at the rate specified in the original instrument, for a total claimed debt of $940. It stated that the debt was due in full within 30 days or the claimant would exercise its right to the property pledged as collateral. $940 in 30 days. She went inside. She sat at the table. She put the notice face down on it and pressed both hands over it, as though the pressure of her palms might somehow change what was printed on the other side. Nathan came in from the barn and stopped when he saw her face. What happened? He said. She turned the paper over. He read it twice, he set it down. The silence lasted about 4 seconds. Mountain Western Land Holdings, he said. Holloway, she said. He's created a legal entity to hold the debt. It distances him personally. If we challenge it, we're challenging a company, not a man. It makes it harder to connect to his broader pattern. He found the Santa Fe record. Before my letter arrived, she said. He had it already. He's been sitting on it, waiting for the right moment, and my letter asking for verification. She stopped. My letter may have told him we knew about it. He moved up his timeline. Because of my letter, she said quietly. Not self-recrimination, just precision. She needed to understand exactly what had happened. You couldn't have known, Nathan said. I should have anticipated it. She straightened. Set the notice aside. All right, 30 days. Let's talk about what we do with 30 days. Can we fight it legally? Possibly. The test itself may be legitimate, the original loan was real, and the record survived. But the acquisition of that debt by Mountain Western Land Holdings may not be clean. Debt instruments can be bought and sold, but the process has to be documented. And if Holloway or whatever associate he used acquired this through irregular means, that's challengeable. How do we find out? We need to see the full chain of acquisition. How the debt got from Gideon Cross's estate, assuming it was properly part of his estate, to Mountain Western Land Holdings. Every transfer, every signature, every filing. She picked up her pen. I'm going to write to Judge Aldrich today, not just for advice this time. I'm going to ask him to recommend a federal attorney who specializes in land and debt disputes. That costs money, Nathan said. I know. He was quiet for a moment. I have money extravagantly, but enough. My father was careful. Whatever else he was, he paused. The whole point of holding this land is to hold it. What's the point of saving money on a lawyer if I lose the land the money was saved from? Eliza looked at him. That's the right way to think about it, she said. The second thing that happened that day arrived in the afternoon. It was Tom Miller. He came riding hard up the mountain trail, which was notable because Tom Miller was a deliberate man who didn't ride hard without reason. And he arrived at Nathan's cabin with his hat in his hand and an expression that mixed anger and bewilderment in a way that told Eliza immediately that something had happened to him and he hadn't fully processed what it was yet. Nathan, he said, and then he saw Eliza at the table, and his expression shifted into the polite uncertainty men of his generation, showed when they encountered a woman in a context they hadn't expected. Ma'am, beg your pardon. Eliza Morgan, she said. I'm managing Mr. Cole's accounts. Sit down, Mr. Miller. Tell us what happened. He sat. He turned his hat in his hands. He was a big man, weathered, probably 60 years old, with the particular solidity of someone who'd worked the same land for decades and had been counting on it to be there when he was done. A man came to my ranch this morning, Tom said, lawyer type. Served me with a notice, said the county assessor's office had conducted a review of my property assessment and found it had been significantly undervalued. They're proposing a reassessment that would triple my property taxes retroactively for the past 3 years. Eliza set down her pen. Triple, Nathan said, with back payment due within 60 days, or the county has grounds to place a lien on the property. Tom looked between them. I can't pay 3 years of triple taxes in 60 days. I don't have that kind of money sitting anywhere. And if there's a lien... Did the notice name the assessor? Eliza asked her. County Assessor Baxter. Tom looked at her with the expression of a man who wasn't sure why he was answering questions from a woman he'd just met but was doing it anyway because something in her manner suggested it was the correct thing to do. I've never had any trouble with Baxter before. Never had a reassessment in 20 years. Have any of your neighbors received similar notices, she asked. Tom blinked. I don't know. I came straight here when I got it. I need you to find out, she said. Today if you can. Ride to the Delgado brothers. Ride to the other Valley properties if you have time. Find out if anyone else has received a tax reassessment notice in the past week. Tom looked at Nathan. Do what she says, Tom. Tom put his hat back on. He looked at Eliza one more time with the expression of a man filing something away for later consideration. You think this is connected to something? I think everything is connected to something, she said. Please ride, Mr. Miller. We need that information today. He rode. Nathan turned to her the moment the door closed. He's moving on all fronts simultaneously. Yes, she said. He's done waiting. The debt notice to us, the tax reassessment to Miller. He's compressing the timeline for everyone. He wants multiple property owners under financial pressure at the same time so that each one is focused on his own crisis and nobody steps back to see the larger picture. But we can see it. We can see it, she said, which means we need to use it. She was already writing. The reassessment of Miller's property, if it's been done fraudulently, through a county assessor acting outside his legitimate authority at the direction of a private party, that's not a civil matter. That's a criminal one. Nathan sat down across from her. You're talking about going to federal authorities. I'm talking about building a case so complete and so clearly documented that when we put it in front of a federal marshal, he has no choice but to act on it. She looked up. Nathan Holloway's strength is that each individual piece of what he does looks almost legal. The low offer looks like legitimate negotiation. The debt claim looks like a creditor collecting what's owed. The tax reassessment looks like routine county business. But when you lay them all side by side, when you show the timing, the coordination, the fact that all of these things are happening simultaneously to people who happen to be the downstream water users from your land. She tapped the table. It stops looking almost legal. It starts looking like what it is. Which is coordinated fraud, conspiracy, abuse of public office. She paused. And if we can connect it to the New Mexico pattern, it's not a one-time local dispute. It's a man who has done this before and moved on and is doing it again. Nathan's expression had settled into the particular focused stillness she'd come to recognize as him at his most serious. The version of him that existed before he'd learned to be alone, the man his father must have intended when he built a ranch and left it to his son. A man capable of standing up for something. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "Time," she said. "You've had both," he said simply. Tom Miller came back that evening with news that hit the room like a stone dropped into still water. Every downstream property had received a notice. The Delgado brothers, both parcels, separate notices, same assessor. The two smaller homesteads on the eastern slope, every single water-dependent property in the valley had been hit with a reassessment in the same week. 7 properties, 7 families, all simultaneously under financial pressure that individually each would struggle to fight. "They're all scared," Tom said. He was sitting at Nathan's table again, and this time Roberto Delgado had come with him, a lean, quiet man in his 50s, who had just almost nothing to say, but who held himself with the contained intensity of someone keeping a great deal of emotion under very deliberate control. "Roberto's boys are talking about whether they can sell before the lien hits. The Hawthorns, Carl Hawthorne, told me this afternoon he'd already been contacted by a buyer." Eliza asked. Tom and Roberto exchanged a look. "A company," Roberto said. His voice was quiet and precise. "Called Mountain Western Land Holdings." The name landed in the room like a confirmation of something that had been a theory until this moment and was now a fact. "He's already moved in with the purchase offers," Nathan said. "Before the families even have time to look for alternatives," Eliza said. She stood up. She looked at Tom and Roberto directly. "I need you to listen to me very carefully, both of you." They looked at her. The buyer who approached the Hawthorns is the same man who has filed a fraudulent debt claim against Nathan's land, and who has, we believe, been directing the county assessor to conduct these reassessments illegally. His name is Victor Holloway. He has done this before in New Mexico territory 4 years ago, and he will do it again somewhere else if we allow him to succeed here. Roberto Delgado's eyes moved slowly to Nathan. "Is this true?" he asked. "Every word of it," Nathan said. Roberto looked back at Eliza. "What can be done? I need 2 things from your families," she said. "First, no one sells. Not Carl Hawthorne, not the Delgado boys, not anyone in this valley. I understand the pressure. I understand that the notices are designed to make selling feel like the only option. But the moment one property sells to Mountain Western Land Holdings, it strengthens Holloway's position on every subsequent acquisition. You have to hold. And the taxes," Tom said. "Some of these families can't." "I'm working on that," she said. "The reassessment was improper, potentially criminal. If I can establish that in documentation, the county cannot legally enforce the retroactive payment while the validity is under dispute." "That much time?" Roberto asked. "Enough," she said. "If we move fast." She looked at them both steadily. "The second thing I need," she said, "is your testimony. Both of you, and as many of the other Valley families as will agree. Written statements about the surveyors who came to your properties without authorization, the timing of the reassessment notices, any contact you've had from Mountain Western Land Holdings or anyone connected to Holloway. Every conversation, every visit, every document you've received." She paused. "I'm building a case. I need the evidence to be complete." Tom Miller looked at Nathan. "She's something," he said, And it was not said with condescension, but with the specific admiration of a man who had just watched someone he'd underestimated demonstrate that they were precisely what the situation required. "Yes," Nathan said, "she is." They stayed until dark, Tom and Roberto, going through every detail they could recall while Eliza wrote, and Nathan listened and asked occasional precise questions. By the time they left, she had 14 pages of notes and a picture of Holloway's operation that was no longer theoretical. It was documented. It wasn't yet complete, it wasn't yet airtight. But it was real, and it was recorded, and it was hers. The letter from Catherine Marsh arrived 4 days later. Eliza opened it alone in the morning, while Nathan was in the barn. She read it standing at the table with the early light coming through the east window, and by the time she reached the third paragraph, she had put her free hand flat on the table to steady herself. Catherine Marsh's husband, Elias Marsh, was willing to testify. Not just to provide documentation to testify formally. Under oath, before whatever court or federal authority required it. He had, Catherine wrote in her clear, careful hand, waited 4 years for an opportunity to address what had happened in New Mexico territory. He had watched 3 families lose their ranches. He had been unable to act at the time because the case had never reached a court. The families had sold before the legal process could be invoked. But he had kept his records, every document, every filing, every correspondence from Holloway's legal representatives. He had kept all of it. And he was, Catherine said, very much prepared to use it. Eliza sat down. She held the letter in both hands and breathed slowly and felt something move through her that was not quite relief and not quite triumph, but was in the territory of both the particular feeling of a person who has been building something carefully in the dark and has just seen the first light confirm that the structure is holding. When Nathan came inside, she was still sitting with the letter. He took one look at her face and sat down across from her. She handed him the letter. He read it. When he looked up, she said, "We have a witness. A lawyer with documented evidence of the same pattern in New Mexico. If we bring this in front of a federal circuit judge with the combined documentation, your land records, the debt chain irregularities, the fraudulent assessments, Miller and Delgado testimony, and Marsh's New Mexico evidence." "It's not just a strong case," Nathan said. "It's an overwhelming one," she said. They looked at each other across the table. "I need to go to Crestfield," she said. "I need to speak with Judge Aldrich in person. I need to present him with everything we have and ask him to formally recommend federal intervention." Nathan's expression shifted. "You," carefully. "Me," she confirmed, "not us. You're needed here," she said. "If Holloway sees this ranch go empty, he'll wonder where we've gone. And someone needs to be here in case any of the Valley families panic and need steadying." She paused. "Also, if I go to Crestfield alone, it's less conspicuous. A woman going to town is ordinary. Both of us riding in together at this particular moment might read as something significant to whoever's watching." He didn't like it. She could see that clearly, the tightening in his jaw, the particular quality of his stillness that indicated he was controlling a reaction rather than not having one. "Holloway has been in Crestfield," he said. "He knows your face." "Yes," she said, "he does. And he thinks I'm a housekeeper who got in his way for one conversation. He doesn't know what I've built in the past 3 weeks. If he finds out, then..." She held his gaze. "I need you to trust me the way I've been trusting you." That landed. He was quiet for a moment. "Take the mare," he said finally. "She's steadier than the gelding in company." "All right." "And you tell Aldrich," he stopped. Started again. "You tell him everything. Don't hold anything back for strategy. If he's the man you believe he is, the full picture is what he needs." "That's exactly what I plan to do," she said. She left the following morning. Crestfield was a 2-hour ride down the mountain, and Eliza spent the first hour going over the documentation she'd brought, not reading it. She had it memorized, but holding it in her mind, arranging it in the order she would present it, thinking through every question Aldrich might ask, and making sure she had the answer ready before it was needed. The town was busier than she'd expected for a weekday morning, and she moved through it with the particular quality of attention she'd developed over years of being underestimated, visible but unremarkable. A woman on an errand, nothing that required anyone's interest. She found Judge Aldrich home on the north end of town. It was modest, a retired man's house, well kept but without pretension, and he answered the door himself, which told her something favorable about him before she'd said a word. He was older than she'd imagined from his letters. 70, perhaps, with sharp eyes behind wire-framed glasses, and the posture of a man who'd spent decades listening to arguments and had developed the ability to assess them in the first 60 seconds. He looked at her. "Miss Morgan," he said. "Judge Aldrich." She held out her hand with the folder of documents. "Thank you for seeing me. I have a great deal to show you in limited time, so with your permission I'd like to begin immediately." He stepped aside and let her in. She laid it all out for him at his kitchen table. Everything: Nathan's land documentation, the federal filings, the debt notice from Mountain Western Land Holdings and its suspicious acquisition chain, the fraudulent tax reassessments across 7 Valley properties, Miller and Delgado's testimony. Catherine Marsh's letter, the New Mexico pattern. She presented it the way she would have presented it to herself, directly, precisely, without embellishment and without apology. She stated what she knew and how she knew it, and she distinguished clearly between what was documented and what was inference, and she answered his questions with the same precision. He was quiet for a long time when she finished. He went through the documents a second time, slowly, stopping occasionally to hold a page at an angle to the light or to run his finger along a particular line. Then he looked at her over his glasses. "How long have you been working on this?" he asked. 3 weeks, she said. He was quiet again. "Your father is Samuel Morgan," he said. She met his eyes steadily. "Yes, I know Samuel Morgan," Aldrich said. "I have known him for 30 years. He is not a stupid man." He paused. "I have also never understood how a man of reasonable intelligence could fail so completely to notice what was sitting at his own table." He gestured at the documents in front of him. "Now I'm looking at the evidence of what he failed to notice, and I find I'm not entirely surprised." Eliza said nothing. "What do you need me?" Aldrich asked. "A formal recommendation to the Federal Circuit Court for a marshal's investigation," she said. "And if possible, a temporary injunction against enforcement of the tax reassessment notices while the validity is under legal review." "The injunction would need to be filed by an attorney of record," he said. "I know. I've been in correspondence with a Denver attorney, a man named Carr, who Marsh's letter referenced as having clean standing with the federal circuit." Aldrich asked. The judge almost smiled. "That's a very good choice." "I thought so," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up his pen. "I'll write the recommendation today," he said. "You'll have it before you ride back." The relief hit her quietly, without drama, the way real relief usually hits, not a wave, but a settling. The sense of something that has been bearing weight being allowed, finally, to set it down. "Thank you," she said. "Miss Morgan," Aldrich said without looking up from his writing. "When this is concluded, and I believe it will conclude in the way you intend it to, you should consider whether you might make a formal contribution to the county's legal records office. The documentation you've assembled here is," he paused, searching for the precise word. "Exceptional." She looked at him. "I'll consider it," she said. She was back at the cabin before sundown. Nathan heard the horse and came out, and the way he looked at her when she came through the gate, the specific quality of the attention. Not the question of whether she was safe, but the straightforward relief that she was back hit her, somewhere she hadn't expected. "Aldrich will write the recommendation," she said before he could ask. He exhaled. One slow breath. "And the injunction?" "Marcus Carr in Denver will file it. Aldrich is writing him tonight." Nathan nodded. Then he looked at her, really looked, the full attention way he had, and said, "Are you all right?" And the question caught her, because it was so simple and so direct, and because nobody had asked her that with genuine wanting to know in longer than she could clearly remember. "Possibly not ever." "Yes," she said, "I am." He nodded again, took the mare's reins, started walking her toward the barn. "There's food on the stove," he said. "Nathan." He stopped. She looked at him in the fading light, this man who had picked up her bags without a word the first night and made her food and told her about the latch on the inside of the door. who had trusted her with his father's papers and ridden to Denver and sat with her until midnight, going through boxes, and asked her what she needed with the simplicity of someone who actually intended to provide it. "Holloway is going to find out what we've done," she said. "When Carr files the injunction, when the federal marshal's office receives Aldrich's recommendation, it won't stay quiet." "He'll know." "I know," Nathan said. "He's going to come back. He's going to come back harder than before, because we've cost him time and advantage, and men like him don't absorb that without responding." "I know that too. Are you ready for that?" He looked at her steadily. "I've been alone on this mountain for 12 years, he said. Managed everything that came at me without anyone beside me." He paused. "I reckon with you here I can manage this too." It was not a declaration. It was not a romantic speech. It was a true thing said plainly by a man who didn't traffic in false currency, and it landed exactly the way true things land, without decoration, without the need for any. "All right," she said. "Go eat," he said. She went inside. 3 days later, Victor Holloway came back. This time he did not come alone. He rode up to Nathan's cabin with 2 men behind him, not the pleasant-looking businessman she'd met on the porch, but Victor Holloway with his careful smile removed and something considerably less pleasant in its place. The 2 men with him were large and quiet in the specific way of men who are paid to be present rather than to contribute to a conversation. Nathan stepped out of the cabin onto the porch before they reached the door. He stood with his hands at his sides and his feet planted in the way of a man who is not moving. "Holloway, Mr. Cole." Holloway stopped his horse at the gate. He didn't dismount, keeping the height advantage, Eliza noted from the window where she was standing with the documents she'd spent 3 weeks preparing. "I believe you're aware of the outstanding debt claim against your eastern parcel." "I'm aware of it. The 30-day window is running," Holloway said. "I want to give you the opportunity to resolve this sensibly. The original offer for the land remains open. If you apply the sale proceeds against the debt, you come out without liability and with cash in hand." "I'm not selling," Nathan said. Holloway's expression didn't change precisely, but something beneath it did. "Mr. Cole, I understand attachment to family land. I respect it. The law is not sentimental. The debt is real and documented in." The door opened. Eliza came out. She held a folder of papers in front of her, organized and precisely ordered. And she walked to stand beside Nathan on the porch, and she looked at Victor Holloway with an expression that contained neither hostility nor fear, but only the particular quality of attention a person directs at a problem they have already solved and are now demonstrating the solution to. "Mr. Holloway," she said, "the debt claim filed by Mountain Western Land Holdings was transmitted to the Federal Circuit Court 3 days ago, along with a formal request for investigation into the acquisition chain of the instrument. We have documentation indicating the transfer from the Cross Estate was not properly probated, and that the acquiring entity Mountain Western Land Holdings may not have obtained clean title to the instrument." Holloway looked at her. The 2 men behind him were very still. "Additionally," she continued, her voice unhurried, "and even Marcus Carr of Denver attempted injunction in the Federal Circuit Court, preventing enforcement of the recent tax reassessments across 7 county properties. Pending investigation into whether those reassessments were conducted under legitimate county authority or at the direction of a private party." She paused. "Judge Aldrich has provided a formal recommendation supporting that investigation." Something happened in Holloway's face. It was not dramatic. It was the thing that happens when a man who has built a careful strategy encounters the information that the other side has been building one too, and has been further along than he knew. "You've been busy," he said. His voice was still controlled. "But barely." "Yes," she said, "we have. A county injunction and a federal inquiry," he said. "You understand that those processes take time. That the debt clock continues to run while..." Judge Aldrich has also provided a letter to the Federal Land Office formally authenticating Nathan's documentation of the eastern parcel, she said, which establishes clear federal jurisdiction over any debt instrument claiming that land as collateral. Which means any enforcement action on the debt claim must go through federal channels, not county ones. She held out one of the pages in her folder. You're welcome to have your attorneys verify that. Holloway did not take the page. He looked at her for a long moment. At Nathan. Back at her. Who are you, he asked, and it wasn't a social question. It was the question of a man who had walked into a situation he'd constructed carefully and was now looking at it from the wrong side and trying to understand how it had been reversed. Eliza looked at him. I'm the person who manages this ranch's accounts, she said. And I'm very good at my job. One of the men behind Holloway shifted slightly in his saddle. Nathan's eyes moved to the movement, tracked it, and moved back to Holloway without any change in his own posture. He hadn't moved since he came out on the porch. He didn't move now. This isn't over, Holloway said. No, Eliza agreed. It isn't. But the terms have changed. She squared the folder in her hands. Mr. Holloway, I would encourage you to speak with your attorneys about the New Mexico Territory case and the documentation that Elias Marsh is prepared to bring forward. I believe they will advise you that the pattern of activity we have documented here and constitutes something that a federal court will find very difficult to view as coincidental. The color had changed in Holloway's face, not dramatically. But she saw it. You have 30 days, she said. Same as us. That's how long before the federal inquiry reaches the point where voluntary disclosure becomes considerably less advantageous than it is right now. She held his gaze. You know what you've done, Mr. Holloway, and now you know that we know. What you do with that information is your decision. Holloway looked at her for one long, hard moment. Then he turned his horse. He rode out. The two men followed without a word. Nathan and Eliza stood on the porch until the sound of hoofbeats was gone. Then Nathan turned to look at her. She was still holding the folder. Her hands, she noticed, were completely steady. She found that interesting. The fear had existed. She'd felt it, but it had been something she'd moved through rather than stopped by, the way you move through cold water when there's something on the other side worth reaching. You told him about Marsh, Nathan said. Yes. He didn't know about Marsh. No, he didn't. She looked at Nathan. I wanted him to know that we're not just defending. I wanted him to understand that we have the ability to move forward, not just hold ground. Nathan looked at her for a moment. You gave him the option to back down, he said. I gave him the information he needs to make a rational decision, she said. Whether he makes one is his choice. Do you think he will? She thought about the color she'd seen change in Holloway's face. The quality of his silence in the last moment before he turned his horse. The thing that happens in a person's expression when they understand that the situation has moved past where they intended it to go. I think he'll consult his attorneys, she said. And I think his attorneys will tell him something he won't want to hear. And if they don't, she looked at him directly. Then we see him in federal court, she said. Nathan held her gaze. Then he said quietly, Eliza. Yes. When you first came up that trail, 2 bags, $40, 3 days of walking. I remember. You planned all of this, he said, not accusing. Wondering. No, she said. I planned to arrive. Everything after that I figured out as I went. He was quiet for a moment. Your father, he said, is going to have to live for the rest of his life, knowing he did what he did to you. She looked out toward the trail where Holloway had gone. At the mountains beyond it, at the enormous, indifferent, permanent country that had become, without her planning for it, the place where she had finally found out what she was made of. He made his choice, she said. I made mine. The sun was dropping behind the peaks and the light was going full gold in the way it did at this altitude, and the valley below was settling into the long blue shadow that preceded the mountain dark. And somewhere down in that valley, 7 families were going to wake up tomorrow with slightly better odds than they'd had this morning, because 2 people on a porch had stood their ground. She went back inside. She had work to do. The week after Holloway rode away from Nathan's porch was the quietest week Eliza had known since arriving in the mountains. Not peaceful exactly. The work continued, it always continued, and the federal inquiry meant correspondence flowing in both directions. Documents requiring response, letters from Marcus Carr in Denver that needed careful reading and careful reply. But the quality of the urgency had changed. It was no longer the urgency of defense, of closing gaps before someone exploited them. It was the urgency of forward movement, of a case building toward its conclusion under its own accumulated weight. Tom Miller rode up twice that week. Roberto Delgado sent his oldest son, Miguel, with a written statement about the unauthorized surveyor that was so precisely detailed. Eliza read it 3 times with something approaching admiration. The Hawthorne family, who had been closest to selling, sent Carl Hawthorne in person on the 4th day, a quiet man, hat in hand, who sat at Nathan's table and said he'd told the Mountain Western Land Holdings representative that he was no longer interested in selling, and who looked at Eliza when he said it with the expression of a man who had made a decision he was not entirely sure of and was looking for confirmation that it was the right one. "You did the right thing," she told him. He nodded slowly. "My father built that ranch," he said. "I keep thinking about what he'd say if I sold it to someone like that." "He'd say you made the right call," Nathan said from across the room. Carl looked at Nathan, then back at Eliza. "Is it going to work, what you're doing?" "Yes," she said. Not because she was certain, she was very close to certain, but not all the way there, but because Carl Hawthorne needed to hear it from someone who believed it, and she did believe it. And the difference between almost certain and certain was not worth the cost of his faith dissolving in the gap. He left looking steadier than he'd arrived. Nathan watched him ride out and said, without turning from the window, "You told him yes." "I did. You're that sure?" "I'm sure enough," she said. And he needed something solid to hold on to. I gave him something solid. Nathan turned then and looked at her in the way he'd been looking at her with increasing frequency over the past weeks, the full, unhurried look of a man who had spent a great deal of time learning to observe things accurately and was applying that same careful attention to something that mattered considerably more to him than cattle prices or land surveys. She looked back at him without flinching. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. But it wasn't nothing, and they both knew it, and neither of them said anything further about it, because there was still work to do, and they had both agreed, in the unspoken way of two people who understand each other well enough to agree without speaking, that the work came first. Marcus Carr's letter arrived on a Friday morning, 10 days after Holloway's visit to the porch. Liza opened it alone again. Nathan was at the fence line, the same fence line where she'd first seen him, a fact that struck her with a small private significance she didn't examine too closely. She read it standing at the table, and this time she read it only once, because it was very clear and because its meaning required no second pass. The Federal Circuit Court had accepted Judge Aldrich's recommendation. A marshal had been assigned to the investigation. The temporary injunction against the tax reassessments had been granted and served on County Assessor Baxter, effective immediately. And the part that made her sit down, slowly, with the letter still in her hands, Marcus Carr had received, through formal legal channels, notification that Victor Holloway's attorneys had contacted the court, requesting a meeting to discuss, as the correspondence phrased it, a potential resolution to the matters under investigation. Holloway was looking for a way out. She sat with that for a moment. Not triumphant, or not only triumphant, there was something more complicated in it. The shape of what had been built over the past 6 weeks, sitting in her hands in the form of a letter from a Denver attorney who didn't know her 3 months ago, was almost too large to hold all at once. She had to take it in pieces. The debt claim against Nathan's eastern parcel under investigation, unenforceable pending resolution. The tax reassessments across 7 Valley properties, enjoined invalid for enforcement. The county assessor under federal scrutiny for the first time in his career. Victor Holloway retreating, she put the letter on the table. She went to the door and looked out toward the fence line where Nathan was working, his back to her, the mountain rising behind him the way it always did, enormous and permanent, and entirely unimpressed with human drama. She cupped her hands around her mouth. "Nathan," he turned. "Come inside," she called. "I have something to show you." He set down what he was working on and walked toward the cabin, and she went back to the table and put the letter into the center of it and stood with her hands at her sides and waited. He came through the door. He looked at her face. He crossed to the table without stopping, picked up the letter, read it. He read it again. Then he set it down. He looked at her. "It worked," he said. "It's working," she said. "There's still the hearing." Still the formal resolution process. Holloway hasn't formally withdrawn, he's negotiating, which means he's calculating whether the cost of continuing is greater than the cost of settling. But yes, she held his gaze, it worked. Nathan Cole was not a man who showed emotion extravagantly. She had learned that in 6 weeks of close quarters and high stakes he processed things internally, revealed them slowly, kept his reactions proportionate and controlled. It was not coldness, it was the discipline of a man who had learned that the mountains didn't care how you felt, and so you'd better be able to function regardless. But she watched something move through his face now that was not controlled. Just for a moment. The weight of 12 years alone on this land. Fighting a slow-losing battle against isolation and loss, and the accumulated pressure of being the last person standing in a story his father had started, all of that moved through his expression in one unguarded moment. And then it settled, and he looked like himself again. "My father's land. Your land," she said. "It always was." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something she hadn't expected. He pulled out a chair at the kitchen table, not his usual chair, but the one beside it, the one closest to where she always sat, and he sat in it. He put his elbows on the table, and his face in his hands, and he breathed. Just breathed. She sat in her own chair, next to him, and she didn't say anything. She let him have it, the exhale of 6 weeks of sustained tension, the release of something that had been held very tightly finally being allowed to loosen. After a while he lowered his hands and straightened and said, "What happens next?" "Carr will represent us at the hearing," she said. "He'll present the full documentation. Aldrich has agreed to provide a formal statement on the land record authentication. Elias Marsh will appear by deposition. He and Catherine are traveling to Colorado next month." "They're coming here? Catherine wanted to meet you," she said. And she paused. "I think he needs to see this through. He's been carrying the New Mexico case for 4 years. This is his resolution too." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "You have a remarkable set of people in your life," he said. "For a woman whose father thought she had no connections." "My father thought my world ended at his property line," she said as she had once before. "He was wrong about that. He was wrong about a lot of things." She looked down at the letter. "He'll hear about this eventually," she said. "Word travels when it don't," Nathan said. She looked up. "Don't spend time thinking about how he'll receive it," Nathan said. His voice was even and direct and held something she recognized as protectiveness, though it didn't look like the kind of protectiveness that assumed she needed protecting. It looked like the kind that simply didn't want to see her waste herself on a man who'd proven he wasn't worth the expenditure. "What he thinks and what he feels when he hears about this, that's not your concern. You didn't do any of this, so he'd feel something." "No," she said. "I didn't." "Then don't give him space in this moment," Nathan said. "This moment is yours. You built this. From nothing. From $40 and 2 bags and a letter that was supposed to dispose of you." He held her gaze. "This is yours, Eliza." She held very still. Nobody had ever said her name exactly that way. With the full weight of recognition in it, the acknowledgement not of what she could do, she'd had that, cautiously, from Nathan almost from the beginning, but of who she was. The whole of it. The 26 years, and the kitchen table at midnight, and the letters she'd written in secret, and the walk up the mountain trail, and every quiet act of knowing she'd performed in rooms full of people who didn't see her. She felt it land somewhere deep, and she didn't try to deflect it. "Thank you," she said. It came out quieter than she intended. He nodded once. Then, in the way they always returned to it when the weight of the personal became too large to hold all at once, "What do you need me to do for the hearing?" She picked up her pen. "Tell me everything you remember about your father's original conversations with Gideon Cross," she said. "I want your testimony to be as specific as possible." He told her. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out, in the county seat, a larger town than Crestfield, with a federal courthouse and a circuit judge who came through on rotation. Marcus Carr arrived 2 days before it to prepare. He was younger than Eliza had imagined from his letters, mid-30s, with the contained energy of someone who ran on precision and coffee, and the particular satisfaction of a well-constructed argument. He sat at Nathan's kitchen table and went through everything Eliza had assembled and said, "At the end of 2 hours, I've been practicing for 11 years, and I've never walked into a hearing with documentation this complete." "I had good material to work with," she said. He looked at her. Then at Nathan. Then back at her with the expression of a man revising something. "You understand that you should be presenting this yourself," he said. "Not as counsel, I'll handle the legal arguments. But as a witness, your testimony about how you identified the patterns, how you traced the acquisition chain on the debt instrument, how you documented the coordinated nature of the assessments, that's going to be significantly more compelling than me summarizing it." She'd known this was coming and had been sitting with it for a week. "In a federal court," she said, "as a woman with no legal standing. As a witness," he said, "you have every right to testify to what you observed and documented. Your gender is irrelevant to the evidentiary record. What you found is what you found, and it's in the documents whether you're male or female. Some judges will dismiss it before I finish the first sentence." "Judge Harrow won't," Carr said. "I know his record. He cares about the evidence. If the evidence is solid, and it is, he'll listen to whoever presents it." He paused. "I would not ask you to do something that would harm our case, Miss Morgan. I'm asking because I believe your testimony makes it stronger." She looked at Nathan. Nathan said nothing, because it was her decision, and he knew it, and he wasn't the kind of man who made other people's decisions for them. But she read his expression, that particular steady quality, the one that said, "I believe you can do this," without putting any pressure on the fact that he believed it. "All right," she said. "Tell me exactly what you need me to say." Carr smiled, a quick professional flash of it. "Start at the beginning," he said. "Tell me what you found on the first morning," she told him. By the time Catherine and Elias Marsh arrived the following day, Eliza had given her account 3 times to Carr's careful questioning and felt it settle into the shape it would hold in the courtroom, precise, sequential, grounded in the documents she had built over 6 weeks, not in argument or interpretation, but in the straightforward account of what she had seen, what it had told her, and what she had done about it. Catherine Marsh was a small, direct woman in her 60s who embraced Eliza the moment she stepped through the door, as though they had met in person before, which they hadn't. Their whole history was letters, careful and regular over 6 years. The kind of correspondence that builds genuine knowledge of a person without the physical evidence of shared space. It was strange and entirely comfortable at the same time. "I'm so proud of you," Catherine said quietly, into her ear. Eliza held on for a moment longer than she normally would have. Elias Marsh was taller than his wife, quiet and deliberate, with the eyes of a man who had looked at a great deal of human dishonesty professionally, and had not become cynical about it so much as deeply, specifically committed to countering it wherever it appeared. He shook Nathan's hand and then turned to Eliza and said, "You've done in 6 weeks what I couldn't accomplish in 4 years. I want you to know I understand what that required." "You had the same information," she said. "The family sold before the case could be made. And you made sure that didn't happen here," he said. "That's not the information, that's you. The night before the hearing, nobody slept particularly well." Eliza lay in the back room, the same narrow bed she'd fallen into on the first night, exhausted past feeling, which now felt like the most familiar surface in the world, and listened to the mountain dark and went through the sequence of her testimony one final time, and then deliberately stopped going through it, because she had it, she knew she had it. And the continued repetition was anxiety talking rather than preparation. She thought instead about the morning her father had handed her the letter, about the way he hadn't looked up, about the door, about the trail, about the moment Nathan had picked up her bags without asking, about the first morning with the ledgers, when she'd felt the particular quality of doing work that mattered in a place where she was allowed to do it. She thought about all of it, and she felt something settle through her, that was not triumph and not peace exactly, but something in the territory between them, the particular quiet of a person who has come through something and knows it. She slept. The federal courthouse was 2 hours' ride from the mountain. They went as a group: Nathan, Eliza, Carr, The Marshes and Tom Miller and Roberto Delgado met them there with 3 other Valley property owners, all of them in their best clothes and their Sunday composure, gathered together in the way of people who have been separately afraid for a long time and have discovered the specific courage of being afraid together. Victor Holloway arrived with 2 attorneys. He looked, Eliza thought, like a man who had spent the past 10 days being told by the people he paid to advise him that the situation was not recoverable by the means he preferred, and who had not yet fully made peace with that information. His expression was controlled, but the control was visible, which meant it was costing him something. Their eyes met across the room for a moment. She held the look evenly, and then turned back to Carr and said, "The 1,849 grant documentation, do you have the federal receipt on top or behind the authentication letter?" "Behind," he said. "Put it on top," she said. "Harrow will want to see the federal acknowledgement before he reads the authentication. It establishes jurisdiction first." Carr reorganized the folder without comment. The hearing began. Judge Harrow was a compact man in his 60s who conducted his courtroom with the economy of someone who had no patience for theater and a great deal of patience for evidence. He let Carr present the full documentation without interruption, asked 4 precise questions that demonstrated he had read and understood everything, and then called Eliza to testify. She stood. She walked to the front of the room. She felt Holloway's attorneys look at her. She felt the particular quality of their attention, the rapid assessment, the calculation of whether to object to her testimony on procedural grounds. She'd discussed this with Carr. He'd said they'll let it go if they're smart, because objecting to the testimony of the person who built the documentary case will make it look like they're afraid of her account, which they are, and Harrow will notice. They let it go, she began. She told it the way she'd practiced from the beginning. From the first morning with the ledgers, from the supplier overcharge that had been the first signal that someone had been operating on the assumption that Nathan Cole wasn't paying attention. She moved through it in sequence, document by document, connection by connection. She spoke clearly and at a pace that gave the judge time to follow without simplifying anything that didn't require simplification. She was not nervous. She was, if she was honest about it, exactly where she was supposed to be. Holloway's attorneys cross-examined her for 40 minutes. They were skilled. They tried 6 different approaches challenging her credentials, questioning her methodology, suggesting her conclusions were inferential rather than documentary, implying her relationship to Nathan Cole created bias, attempting to establish that the coordination she'd identified could be explained by coincidence rather than conspiracy. She answered each question directly. She distinguished, each time, between what the documents showed and what she had concluded from them, and she demonstrated, each time, that the documents supported the conclusion without requiring the conclusion to be taken on faith. She did not become defensive. She did not become aggressive. She simply held the line of what she knew and how she knew it, clearly and consistently for 40 minutes, until Holloway's lead attorney sat down with the expression of someone who has tried to find a door in a wall and has established, definitively, that there isn't one. Elias Marsh testified next. He laid out the New Mexico case with the methodical completeness of a man who had been waiting 4 years for an appropriate court and had organized his evidence accordingly. He connected the methods, the unauthorized surveying, the implied documentation challenges, the coordinated acquisition approach, the use of legal entities to distance the principle to what had been documented in Colorado, with the precision of someone demonstrating that 2 things are not coincidentally similar, but deliberately identical. By the time he finished, the room was very quiet. Judge Harrow looked at the documentation in front of him for a long moment. Then he looked at Holloway's. "Counselors," he said, "before I consider the evidence before me, I'd like to give your client an opportunity to address the court directly." Holloway's lead attorney stood. He leaned toward his client. A brief, tense conversation happened in whispers. Then the attorney straightened. "Your Honor," he said, "my client wishes to request a brief recess to discuss a possible resolution." The Valley ranchers in the back of the room, Tom Miller, Roberto Delgado, Carl Hawthorne, and the others did not react visibly, because they were men who had learned to be careful with hope. But Liza felt the shift in the room like a change in air pressure. She looked at Carr. Carr was writing something on a piece of paper. He slid it across to her. It said, "He's going to settle." She looked at Nathan, who was sitting behind the bar to her left. He met her eyes. She gave him the smallest possible nod. He closed his eyes briefly and opened them. The recess lasted 22 minutes. When Holloway's attorney returned, he presented Judge Harrow with a proposed resolution. Mountain Western Land Holdings would formally withdraw the debt claim against the Coal Eastern parcel. Victor Holloway would provide a sworn statement to be held by the court, acknowledging the pattern of land acquisition activities in Colorado and New Mexico territory. The tax reassessment notices against all 7 Valley properties would be formally rescinded. Holloway would make no further land acquisition approaches in this region. And a financial settlement, the terms of which would be negotiated with Marcus Carr, would be provided to compensate the affected property owners for costs incurred. Judge Harrow read through the proposed resolution. He looked at Marcus Carr. "Is this acceptable to your clients?" Carr looked at Nathan. Nathan looked at Eliza. She read the document. She went through it line by line with the same attention she'd given to every document in the past 6 weeks. She found 2 places where the language was soft enough to be exploitable, and she wrote precise replacement language in the margin and passed it to Carr, who read it and nodded, and presented it to Harrow. Harrow read the amendments. "The amendments are reasonable," he said. "Counselors, prepare the amended resolution for signature." It was done. Not with drama, not with a speech, or a confrontation, or any of the things that stories were supposed to contain at their climax. It was done with paperwork and signatures and the particular anticlimactic quality of real justice, which looks less like a thunderclap and more like a door closing firmly on something that will not reopen. Victor Holloway signed the resolution without looking up. He did not look at Eliza as he walked out. She watched him go. She thought, 4 families in New Mexico who lost their ranches. 7 families in this valley who almost did. She thought, it's not enough, and it's what there is. And it's more than there was yesterday. She turned around. Nathan was standing behind her. He had his hat in his hand, that gesture, the gesture she'd seen valley men make when they were acknowledging something they didn't have words for. The physical courtesy of it, and he was looking at her with everything in his face that he'd been keeping carefully arranged and organized for 6 weeks, and all of it was visible now, all at once, without any particular management of how it would land. She looked done, she said. "It's done," he agreed. She breathed in and breathed out. "I should go speak with Tom and Roberto." "The settlement terms will need to be Eliza," he said. She stopped. "In a minute," he said. 1 minute. She waited. He looked at her for that minute, or what felt like a minute, in the time-distorting way of moments that are carrying more than their surface, and then he said quietly, and without preamble, "Stay." Just that. Not "I'd like you to consider staying." Not "if you want to, you're welcome to." Not wrapped in kitten air qualifications or the careful language of a man managing his own expectations. "Stay." She looked at him. "My father's going to hear about this," she said. "People will talk. They'll say there's a woman living at Nathan Cole's ranch." "Let them say it," he said. "They'll be right, Nathan. You came up that mountain trail with $40 and 2 bags," he said, "and you've built something here that's going to stand long after both of us are gone. The Valley families, the legal record, the land." He paused. "I'm not asking you to stay because you're useful, Eliza. I'm asking you to stay because this is where you belong. Because when I think about this place without you in it, I don't." He stopped. Started again. "I've been alone here for 12 years and I was used to it. Now I've been not alone for 6 weeks and I can't go back to what I was used to." She held very still. She thought about the door closing. She thought about the trail. She thought about the first morning with the ledgers and the feeling of doing work that mattered in a place where it was wanted. "The room at the back," she said. "What about it?" "The first night you told me there was a latch on the inside of the door." "I did. You were telling me I was safe," she said. "That I could decide how much of this place I let in. Yes, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. I don't need the latch anymore, she said. He was very still. Then slowly, something moved in his face, not dramatic, not performed, but real in the specific way that the things Nathan and Cole felt were always real, without embellishment, without any distance between the feeling and the showing of it. No, he said. No, she said. He reached out and took her hand, the same gesture he'd made once before at the kitchen table, one brief moment of contact, but this time he didn't take it back. He held it, carefully, the way he held things he intended to keep. All right, he said. She looked at their joined hands for a moment. Then she looked back at him. I need to go speak with Tom Miller, she said. The settlement terms, I know, he said. And then I need to write to Carr about the formal filing. And there's a letter to Judge Aldrich to confirm the resolutions. I know, he said again, and the quiet amusement in it was the specific kind she'd come to love, unhurried, genuine, the amusement of a man who understood exactly who he was dealing with and found it uncomplicated and right. She squeezed his hand once and let go. She went to find Tom Miller. Catherine Marsh was standing near the back of the room and caught Eliza's eye as she passed. He said nothing. She was a woman who understood when something didn't need commentary, but she smiled, small and certain, the smile of someone who has watched a story arrive at exactly the place it was always going. The settlement was formalized over the following 2 weeks. The Valley families received compensation that didn't replace the months of anxiety, but acknowledged it in the formal language of legal resolution, which was what was available and was better than nothing. County Assessor Baxter resigned under the scrutiny of the federal inquiry. Nobody was surprised, and the county commission appointed a replacement from outside the region who had no relationship with Victor Holloway or his operations. The coal land records, fully consolidated and federally authenticated, were formally filed in the county record office under a cover letter from Judge Aldrich that would make any future challenge both difficult and expensive. Elias Marsh returned to Denver with a deposition that would be kept in the federal court record, not active case material, but available should Holloway's name appear in connection with similar activities elsewhere. I don't think he'll try again, Marsh told Nathan, on the morning he and Catherine left. Not in this region. Men like that recalibrate when the cost gets too high. He'll find another place, another approach. Can we stop that? Nathan asked. Marsh looked at Eliza. She looked at him. The federal record documents the pattern, she said. If it happens again, the connection can be made faster. No, Marsh said. It isn't. They shook hands. Catherine held Eliza for a moment again, and said something quiet near her ear that Eliza would keep to herself, and then they rode toward Denver, and the mountain received its silence back. One morning, 6 weeks after the hearing, a rider came up the trail with a letter. The handwriting on the envelope was Samuel Morgan's. Eliza stood at the door and looked at it for a long moment before she brought it inside. She sat at the kitchen table, her table, with the 3 ledgers that were now organized and complete on the shelf, and the new correspondence files she'd built, and the running account books that showed a ranch operating at a profit for the first time in 5 years, and she opened the letter. It was short. Her father's letters had always been short. He was not a man who used language beyond its functional minimum. It said, I have heard what you did in Fremont County. I have heard the account from 3 different people, and I have no reason to disbelieve any of them. I am writing because I owe you something, and I have spent my life not paying debts. I was wrong about what you were worth. I don't expect you to accept that or to respond. I am writing it because it is true, and because I am old enough now to understand that some truths require saying, even when the saying of them comes too late to repair the thing they concern. Your father Samuel. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the back of the correspondence file. Nathan was at the fence line. Again, always the fence line, always the work, the daily maintenance of a life built by hand. She went to the door and looked out at him. She thought about what he'd asked her once, months ago, sitting across from her with a broken ledger between them. Did he know? She'd said, I told him once. She hadn't told him what her father had answered. Women don't read contracts, Eliza. She looked at the mountains. at the enormous permanent country she had walked into with $40 in 2 bags and arrived at the other side of. She thought, he knows now. She thought it doesn't change anything. And then she picked up her pen and turned to the day's correspondence, because the work was there and the work was hers, and she was exactly where she had chosen to be, on a mountain in Colorado, at a kitchen table that was her table. In a life she had built from the ground up with her own hands and her own mind, and the particular irreducible force of knowing who she was, even when no one else had been willing to see it. Tom Miller's son was getting married in the spring. She was helping with the financial planning for the reception. Roberto Delgado's youngest had started actually reading, sitting down with books because Eliza had been lending him volumes from Nathan's small shelf, and he had discovered at 14 that he liked the way words fit together when they were chosen carefully. Carl Hawthorne had come up the mountain last week, just to say his creek was running clean and strong, and he wanted her to know. The valley was holding. The land was holding. And Eliza Morgan, who had been sent away like a problem, discarded like something without value, handed off to a stranger on a mountain with the quiet cruelty of a man who believed he knew exactly what his daughter was worth, was still here. She had not drifted back. She had not been rescued. She had not waited for someone to see her value and bestow it upon her like a gift she'd been too long denied. She had taken $40 in 2 bags and a broken set of ledgers, and she had built something solid enough to stand against a man with lawyers and patience and a history of winning. She had done it with her mind and her stubbornness, and the accumulated force of 26 years of knowing things in rooms full of people who had decided she knew nothing. And she had done it in a place where one man, from the very first night, had picked up her bags without being asked and made her food, and told her the latch was on the inside of the door, leaving the choice, always, entirely to her. She turned her face toward the mountains. They held their great indifferent silence above everything, as they always did. Not caring, not watching, not providing meaning or validation or the comfort of being witnessed. She didn't need the mountains to witness her. She knew what she had done. The daughter nobody wanted had become the woman nobody could move, and the place her father had sent her to be rid of her was the place she had claimed deliberately, with full knowledge of what she was choosing, as home.